The phone rang at exactly 3 in the morning. My granddaughter was sobbing on the other end of the line. She stated clearly that she was at the police station. She told me her stepmother beat her in the kitchen, but then told the police it was the other way around. Her own father chose to believe his wife over his own flesh and blood. When I walked into that precinct wearing my faded canvas work jacket, the precinct captain took one look at me and went completely pale. He yelled at his officers to remove her handcuffs immediately. He wiped sweat from his forehead and said he had absolutely no idea she was calling me. Before I explain how a supposedly broke retiree commanded a police captain to snap to attention, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who severely underestimated your worth. My name is Aaron Crawford, I am 69 years old, and I spent my entire life building an empire in absolute silence only to watch my own son become an arrogant fool. The harsh ring of the telephone shattered the dead silence of my bedroom at the worst possible hour. I picked up the receiver and heard Aaliyah crying uncontrollably. Her voice shook violently as she explained the nightmare unfolding in real time. She stated clearly that she was sitting in a holding area at the local police precinct. She told me Vanessa attacked her in their kitchen, striking her repeatedly. Then Vanessa dialed emergency services, faked a panic attack, and claimed Aaliyah initiated the assault. My own son Evan chose to support his wife without questioning her fabricated story. A cold, hard knot formed deep in my chest. I did not waste time asking pointless questions or offering empty platitudes. I told her I was on my way to get her. I threw off my blankets and grabbed my faded canvas jacket from the back of the bedroom chair. It was a garment I had worn for 2 decades, frayed at the cuffs and stained with memories of heavy labor. It represented a life of manual grit my son deeply resented and constantly mocked. I gripped the keys to my 2005 Ford truck and walked out the front door into the freezing winter air. The cold wind cut straight through my thin jacket, but the chill outside was nothing compared to the absolute ice settling in my veins. I drove through the empty city streets with a singular, dangerous focus. My granddaughter was sitting in a police station betrayed by her own father and framed by a vicious woman who saw her as nothing but a financial obstacle. The heavy tires of my old truck hummed against the dark asphalt as I sped toward the precinct. Every streetlight I passed illuminated the calculated anger building in my mind. I was going to retrieve my granddaughter, and I was going to confront the absolute failure of a man I once called my son. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the police precinct with heavy steps. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile, unforgiving glare over the chaotic scene in the lobby. Vanessa was delivering a flawless, highly theatrical performance. She sat slumped on a wooden bench, weeping loudly into Evan's shoulder, burying her face in the lapel of his expensive wool coat. She played the traumatized victim perfectly, wiping away imaginary tears while a young patrol officer took notes on his clipboard. Then my eyes found Aaliyah. She sat isolated in the corner, handcuffed to a cold metal bench like a common criminal. Her head was bowed in shame, and the bright overhead lights revealed angry red scratches covering both of her forearms. Those were unmistakable defensive wounds, the kind a person sustains when shielding their face from an attacker. Evan spotted me walking toward the holding area. He instantly released his comforting grip on Vanessa and marched directly into my path. His face twisted into a mask of arrogant disdain. He aggressively ordered me to turn around, go back to my dilapidated house, and stay entirely out of a private household matter. He told me to stick to collecting my meager retirement checks. He spoke to me as if I were a senile nuisance, a beggar trespassing in a place meant only for respectable, wealthy citizens. He declared that Aaliyah had crossed the line and needed to be taught a severe lesson by the legal system. He stated that his wife was the victim of a violent teenager, completely ignoring the visible bleeding marks on his own daughter's arms. He puffed out his chest, attempting to use his physical height and his tailored designer suit to intimidate a man wearing a dirty canvas jacket. Evan truly believed his acquired wealth gave him authority over the truth. He believed his superficial status made him untouchable. He was entirely wrong. I ignored my son completely. I did not raise my voice to argue, nor did I flinch at his pathetic display of authority. Looking at his perfectly tailored suit and his polished leather shoes, a bitter memory surfaced in my mind. I remembered the grueling years I spent working 3 consecutive shifts in a commercial manufacturing plant just to pay the exorbitant tuition for his elite private schooling. I wore actual holes into the soles of my work boots so he could wear pristine uniforms and fit in with the wealthy kids. I sacrificed my own health and comfort to ensure he had every single educational advantage I never received as a young black man growing up in this city. I realized in that sterile precinct lobby that my relentless sacrifice had not produced an honorable man. It had only bred an arrogant hollow shell of a person who valued societal status over his own flesh and blood. He had learned how to make money, but he had catastrophically failed to learn how to be a father. I did not owe this stranger a single word of explanation. I stepped around him with a fluid, determined motion, leaving him mid-sentence. He shouted my name, demanding I turn around and listen to him, but his demanding words simply bounced off my back. I walked straight past the holding area, ignoring Vanessa's sudden gasp, and marched directly to the elevated desk of the duty sergeant. The young officer looked up from his computer, clearly annoyed by my worn appearance. He prepared to dismiss me as just another vagrant walking in from the freezing street to cause trouble. I placed both of my hands flat on his desk and demanded to speak with the commanding officer of the shift. The sergeant opened his mouth to tell me to sit down and wait my turn. He pointed a cheap plastic pen at my chest, instructing me to step back behind the yellow privacy line. I did not move a single inch. Before the young sergeant could call for backup to forcefully remove me from the lobby, the heavy wooden door of the back office swung open. The precinct captain stepped out into the hallway holding a thick stack of incident reports. He was a seasoned veteran of the police force, a man who commanded the entire downtown district with an iron fist. The captain raised his head, and his eyes locked directly onto mine. He took one look at the elderly black man standing at the front desk in a frayed, oil-stained canvas jacket. Instantly, every drop of color drained from the captain's face. The authoritative, relaxed posture he carried completely vanished. He dropped his stack of files onto a nearby chair, the papers scattering across the floor, and practically sprinted across the bullpen toward me. He bypassed the highly confused desk sergeant completely. The captain yelled at his officers to remove the handcuffs from the young girl immediately. He shouted the command with a frantic urgency that made the entire room freeze in place. He turned to me, wiping nervous sweat from his brow, and began apologizing profusely. He extended his hand, stating clearly that his officers had completely mishandled the situation from the moment they arrived at the house. He told me he had absolutely no idea the terrified girl sitting on that metal bench was a Crawford. The silence in the precinct was deafening. 2 officers rushed over to unlock the heavy metal restraints around Aaliyah's wrists. Across the room, Evan and Vanessa stood paralyzed in sheer, unadulterated shock. The theatrical fake tears dried up instantly on Vanessa's face. Evan's jaw slacked as he watched the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the building bow his head in deep deference to his supposedly penniless, useless father. The grand illusion of their superiority shattered right there on the cheap linoleum floor. The real authority in the room had just arrived, and they were completely unprepared for the devastating consequences that were about to follow. The atmosphere inside the sterile precinct lobby shifted instantly as the captain issued his frantic orders. The facade of the fragile victim melted off Vanessa's face the moment she realized her carefully constructed narrative was crumbling before her very eyes. Her eyes widened with an ugly, unadulterated fury that betrayed her true nature. She snatched her expensive designer handbag from the wooden bench, slamming it down against the counter, and demanded to file a formal complaint against the entire police department for blatant bias. Her voice echoed harshly off the concrete walls, shrill and demanding as she screamed that Aaliyah was a violent, out-of-control delinquent who belonged in a maximum-security juvenile detention center. She pointed a manicured, trembling finger at the young girl, aggressively painting a picture of an unhinged teenager who had attacked her without a single ounce of provocation. Evan immediately rallied behind his wife, cementing his utter failure as a parent. Instead of questioning why the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the building was bowing in deep deference to his father, Evan chose to double down on his blind, pathetic allegiance to Vanessa. He stepped forward, wrapping a protective arm around Vanessa's waist, and directed a look of pure, concentrated disgust toward his own flesh and blood. He loudly proclaimed to the room that Aaliyah's behavior was the direct result of the rebellious, unstable genes inherited from her deceased biological mother. He actively weaponized the sacred memory of his late wife to justify the horrific abuse of his daughter. Hearing his son disrespect the memory of a good, honorable woman just to appease a manipulative liar ignited a cold, calculated fire deep inside Aaron's soul. He watched Evan sacrifice his last shred of integrity to protect a shallow, vicious illusion. The absolute failure of Evan's role as a father was on full display in front of a dozen uniformed officers, confirming to Aaron that his son was entirely lost to his own blinding arrogance. Aaron did not waste his breath arguing with a man who had already willfully abandoned his moral compass. He turned his attention back to the precinct captain, his voice carrying the calm, unshakable weight of absolute authority. Aaron coldly instructed the captain to summon the duty forensic photographer, immediately refusing to let the moment pass without gathering irrefutable proof. He pointed a calloused, steady finger at the angry red marks covering Aaliyah's forearms, forcing every officer in the room to look closely at the reality of the situation. With clinical, uncompromising precision, Aaron detailed the strict anatomical difference between offensive assault marks and defensive wounds. He explained loudly and clearly that a person initiating a violent attack sustains injuries on their knuckles and the palms of their hands, whereas the long parallel scratches tearing across Aaliyah's inner arms were the textbook result of someone frantically shielding their face from a relentless, unhinged barrage of blows. It was a brutal, undeniable fact Aaron had learned decades ago while fighting for his own survival on the unforgiving streets of his youth, long before he had built his hidden commercial empire. The precinct captain recognized the undeniable logic and immediately ordered a patrol officer to bring a digital forensic camera to the lobby. The bright, stark flash of the camera illuminated the dark precinct, capturing the undeniable truth etched into the young girl's skin for the official record. Vanessa instinctively pulled her own hands behind her back, burying them deep inside the pockets of her cashmere coat, suddenly terrified that the officers might ask to examine her perfectly unblemished knuckles. The physical evidence completely contradicted her entire theatrical performance, cementing the grim reality of her unprovoked aggression against a minor. Leveraging a quiet, terrifying authority that required absolutely no explanation to the bewildered officers, Aaron walked directly to the main processing desk to sign the release paperwork. He filled out the heavy forms with steady, deliberate strokes of his pen, officially taking legal and physical custody of his granddaughter for the night. The desk sergeant processed the documents with unprecedented speed, hands shaking, slightly eager to appease the man who had just utterly terrified his commanding officer. As Aaron gently guided Aaliyah toward the heavy glass exit doors, Evan made a desperate, foolish attempt to reassert his patriarchal dominance. He marched forward with heavy steps and positioned his body squarely in front of the exit, physically blocking their path to the street. He puffed out his chest, attempting to use his physical height and his tailored suit to intimidate the older man into submission. Aaron did not break his stride or alter his pace. He stopped mere inches away from his son and delivered a single sharp glare that cut straight to the bone. That look contained the crushing weight of decades of silent observation, a piercing, unforgiving judgment that stripped away all of Evan's artificial wealth and exposed the fragile coward hiding underneath. Evan faltered under the immense, suffocating pressure of his father's gaze. His arrogant posture collapsed entirely, and he was forced to step aside, physically making way for the true head of the family. From the holding bench across the room, Vanessa shrieked in absolute, uncontrollable outrage. She vowed loudly to hire the most ruthless, expensive attorneys in the city and sue Aaron for kidnapping, promising to personally destroy his life and drain his retirement accounts by morning. Aaron did not even offer her the dignity of a backward glance. The freezing, biting winter air hit their faces the moment Aaron and Aaliyah walked out of the oppressive police station and stepped into the dark, empty parking lot. The heavy metal doors of the 2005 Ford truck creaked open, offering a familiar, safe sanctuary from the madness they had just barely escaped. They climbed into the cold cabin and Aaron turned the ignition, letting the reliable old engine rumble to life in the dead of the night. The heater slowly began to push warm, comforting air into the tight space, chasing away the physical chill. The very second the heavy truck doors clicked shut, sealing them off from the outside world, a profound and startling transformation took place. Aaliyah stopped crying completely. The terrified, trembling girl from the precinct lobby vanished entirely, replaced by a highly focused young woman who possessed the exact same calculating, iron-willed resilience as her grandfather. She wiped the last remaining tear from her cheek with a steady, uncompromising hand. Reaching deep into the inner pocket of her heavy winter jacket, she pulled out a miniature digital voice recorder. The small metallic device glinted sharply in the faint yellow light of the overhead street lamps. She held it up between them, her eyes locking onto Aaron with absolute chilling clarity. She stated evenly that Vanessa had absolutely no idea The device had been actively recording the entire violent altercation in the kitchen, capturing every single threat and blow, long before the police sirens ever approached the house. The trap had been perfectly set, and the enemy had blindly walked right into it, handing them the ultimate weapon for the war that was about to begin. The drive back to my house passed in absolute silence. Once inside the safety of my kitchen, the heavy oak door locked tightly behind us. I directed Aaliyah to sit at the worn wooden table. I took the small digital recorder from her trembling fingers. I retrieved my laptop from the hall closet, powered it on, and connected the device. The kitchen was completely still, smelling faintly of coffee and old timber. I pressed play. The pristine silence of my home was instantly violently shattered by the audio. Vanessa's voice poured through the laptop speakers, completely unrecognizable from the weeping, fragile woman I had just witnessed at the precinct. This voice was a guttural, unhinged shriek of pure demonic rage. I listened to her hurl vile, degrading insults at my granddaughter. Then came the sharp, unmistakable crack of a heavy slap connecting with skin. Aaliyah flinched in her chair just hearing it. The audio captured the frantic scuffle, followed by the deafening crash of shattering glass against a hardwood floor. What followed next chilled the blood in my veins. Vanessa stopped yelling at Aaliyah. There was a brief, terrifying pause in the recording. Then I heard the heavy, dull thud of bone colliding with solid wood. She had intentionally slammed her own face into the edge of the kitchen cabinet. She did it twice. She was audibly panting, psyching herself up for the performance of a lifetime before dialing the police. I paused the audio. I looked at Aaliyah, who was staring down at her scarred forearms. She had endured this psychological and physical torture alone, while her own father stood in the next room oblivious or willfully ignorant. I did not offer empty words of comfort. I simply hit play again to hear the rest of the damning evidence. The recording continued, capturing the moments immediately after Vanessa deliberately injured herself. She stood over Aaliyah, her voice dropping into a vicious, calculating whisper. She laid out her entire horrifying motive with sickening clarity. She taunted my granddaughter, explaining exactly how the legal system would devour her. Vanessa stated clearly that a violent assault charge would ensure Aaliyah was shipped off to a juvenile detention center. With Aaliyah out of the picture and burdened with a criminal record, Evan's massive family trust fund would automatically default to Vanessa's unborn child. She practically gloated over the legal loophole she believed she had found. She wanted to secure millions of dollars, and she viewed a 16-year-old girl as nothing more than collateral damage. The audio captured Vanessa delivering her final crushing blow. She mocked Aaliyah for threatening to call me. She laughed a cruel, hollow sound, stating that a broke, retired mechanic living in a crumbling house could not afford a cheap public defender, let alone the high-powered legal team required to fight her claims. She weaponized my perceived poverty, using my faded jackets and calloused hands as proof that I was completely powerless to intervene. She told Aaliyah that her grandfather was a penniless relic who would die with nothing to his name. Sitting in my kitchen, I listened to this arrogant woman dismiss my entire existence based on the humble facade I had carefully maintained for years. She believed my modest lifestyle was a symbol of failure. She assumed her acquired wealth gave her the ultimate victory. I sat there completely motionless, letting her toxic arrogance wash over me. The sheer audacity of her scheme was matched only by her profound ignorance of who she was dealing with. She had no idea that her greed had just triggered a catastrophic chain of events. The recording ended with the distant sound of police sirens approaching their house. I disconnected the device and ejected the memory card. Every instinct inside of me screamed to drive straight back to the precinct, to slam the laptop onto the captain's desk and demand Vanessa's immediate arrest. I wanted to see her placed in the exact same handcuffs she had forced upon my granddaughter, but I forced my anger into a cold, calculated focus. I knew exactly how the wealthy operated in this city. If I surrendered the audio right now, the police would arrest her. However, Evan possessed enough liquid capital to post her bail before the sun even finished rising. The moment Vanessa walked free, she would return to that house. She would shred any secondary evidence, manipulate Evan into burying the truth, and hire a ruthless defense team to claim the audio was altered or illegally obtained. A single piece of evidence was not enough to guarantee her absolute downfall. I needed to corner them completely. I needed to dismantle their entire false reality simultaneously. I opened my encryption software. I meticulously copied the raw audio file onto 3 separate external hard drives. I secured each drive with a complex alphanumeric passcode. I handed one drive to Aaliyah, instructing her to keep it hidden inside her shoe. I placed the second drive in my fireproof safe. I slipped the third drive into my breast pocket for my lawyer, Rachel Thorne. I looked at Aaliyah and promised her that the woman who hurt her would lose everything by the end of the week. My retaliation would be absolute. I was not going to give Vanessa the opportunity to fight a legal battle. I was going to construct an inescapable trap that would strip away her power, her money, and her freedom all at once. I walked over to the center of my kitchen and rolled back the faded woven rug that had covered the floorboards for 2 decades. I knelt down and pressed my fingers against the edge of a specific wooden plank. I pried it up, exposing a dark, hollow space beneath the foundation of the house. I reached down and grasped the handle of a heavy steel lockbox. I hauled it upward, placing the cold metal container onto the kitchen table next to the laptop. Aaliyah watched me in silent confusion. I input a 6-digit code into the mechanical keypad and popped the heavy latches. I opened the lid and lifted out a pristine, heavy leather portfolio. The front cover bore the deeply embossed gold crest of Crawford Investment Holdings. I opened the folder to reveal crisp certified bank statements, property deeds, and corporate ledgers. The massive family trust fund that Vanessa was so desperate to steal did not belong to Evan. He was merely listed as a conditional beneficiary, subject to strict moral and legal clauses. He had no control over the principal assets. I was the sole architect of the entire financial empire. I had built a commercial real estate conglomerate from absolute nothing after my wife passed away. I chose to live in this modest house to honor her memory and to force my son to forge his own path without relying on unearned privilege. I controlled every single cent of the fortune Vanessa was willing to destroy a child to acquire. I looked at the corporate seals and the astronomical balances printed on the heavy paper. She wanted to destroy my bloodline for money that she assumed was already hers. She was about to discover that the penniless old mechanic she mocked was actually the master of her entire financial universe. I carefully locked the portfolio back into the steel box. The silent adjustment of my family was about to begin. Morning broke with a violent, relentless pounding that shook the sturdy wooden frame of the front door. The harsh, echoing knocks completely shattered the brief, fragile peace Aaron and Aaliyah had found after returning from the police precinct. Aaron walked deliberately down the narrow hallway, his boots heavy against the floorboards, and unbolted the deadbolt. The heavy door swung inward to reveal Evan and Vanessa standing aggressively on the porch, flanked by a slick, sharp-suited private attorney clutching a premium leather briefcase. Without waiting for a single word of invitation or common courtesy, Evan pushed his way inside, aggressively invading the sacred, quiet space of Aaron's home. Vanessa followed closely behind her husband, clutching her expensive designer handbag to her chest like a shield, wearing an expression of supreme, unearned confidence. The sleazy attorney stepped forward, pulling a thick, intimidating stack of pre-drafted legal documents from his briefcase and slamming them forcefully onto the center of Aaron's modest dining table. The loud, sharp smack of paper hitting wood made Aaliyah flinch visibly from the kitchen doorway. The attorney spoke with a fast, practiced arrogance designed to overwhelm ordinary people. He demanded that Aaliyah immediately sign the full confession placed before her. He stated unequivocally that the document included a complete transfer of physical and legal custody back to Vanessa, framing this extortion as a generous compromise to avoid filing brutal criminal assault charges against a minor. Vanessa stood with her arms crossed, tightly glaring at Aaliyah with a triumphant, predatory smirk. She declared loudly that the police were entirely ready to process the arrest warrant if the teenager refused to comply. They presented the paperwork as an absolute ultimatum, completely expecting the elderly man and the terrified girl to fold instantly under the immense weight of their combined legal intimidation. They fundamentally believed they held all the power in the room. Evan took a slow, deliberate step into the center of the living room, looking around the humble, lived-in space with overt, undisguised disgust. He dragged his judgmental gaze across the faded upholstery of the floral armchair, the slightly scuffed linoleum near the kitchen sink, and the simple, inexpensive framed photographs lining the hallway walls. He turned back to his father and aggressively declared that this dilapidated, pathetic house completely failed even the most basic child welfare standards. He stated confidently that no family court judge in the entire state would ever grant a penniless senior citizen permanent custody over a thriving, successful tech executive. Evan raised his voice, amplifying his arrogant, heartless taunts so they echoed off the plaster walls. He mockingly asked Aaron how a retired, broken-down mechanic living on a fixed, meager pension could possibly expect to afford a protracted legal battle against a man with a massive, endless corporate income. Evan leaned aggressively over the dining table, pressing his white knuckles against the worn wood, and told his father to stop being a stubborn, delusional fool. He framed his harsh, cruel words as practical, necessary advice, insisting that Aaron simply lacked the financial ammunition to protect anyone in the real world. Evan proudly reminded his father of his own sprawling luxury estate, his elite political connections, and his powerful corporate attorneys, painting a picture of absolute, overwhelming dominance. He demanded that Aaron step aside gracefully and allow the wealthy professionals to handle the situation, completely oblivious to the bitter, sickening irony of his demands. Evan stood in the very house that had provided him with food, shelter, and the foundational education for his entire life, actively using his unearned privilege to humiliate the man who had sacrificed everything to build it. He firmly believed his massive bank account made him practically invincible. Aaron did not utter a single word in response to his son's arrogant, venomous tirade. He turned his broad back on the aggressive trio, walked smoothly over to the spotless kitchen counter, and poured himself a cup of black coffee from the old glass carafe. He took a slow, measured sip, allowing the hot, bitter liquid to ground his racing thoughts in the present moment. He deliberately chose not to offer any of them a seat, forcing the wealthy intruders to stand awkwardly in the middle of his home like unwanted common trespassers. He remained entirely silent, letting their loud threats and desperate, pathetic posturing fill the small room. With every crude insult Evan hurled and every smug, triumphant look Vanessa delivered, Aaron meticulously cataloged their deep disrespect. He mentally filed away their profound, irreversible lack of character. As he looked at Aaliyah trembling slightly in the shadow of the hallway, his mind drifted back to the sacred promise he had made to his late wife Naomi. He remembered holding Naomi's frail hand in her final hours, swearing to her that he would always protect their bloodline and shield their precious granddaughter from any harm, regardless of the personal or financial cost. Naomi had always warned him that Evan's relentless obsession with high society status would eventually blind him to true morality. Aaron realized with a heavy, breaking heart that Naomi had been completely right. His total silence was not a sign of surrender, cowardice, or fear. It was the absolute, terrifying calm of a brilliant man who secretly held the power to destroy the entire room. He watched his son proudly trade his core integrity for a manipulative woman who viewed a terrified child as mere collateral damage. Aaron stood perfectly still, turning the ceramic coffee mug in his large hands, letting the fools exhaust their ammunition before he fired his single devastating shot. Vanessa grew visibly frustrated and agitated by Aaron's total, unnerving lack of reaction. She deeply hated his quiet, unshakable dignity. Seeking to provoke a visceral response, she stepped forward with an arrogant, nasty smirk plastered across her perfectly made-up face. She deliberately kicked the beautifully carved leg of Aaron's antique wooden table with her sharp, expensive designer heel, leaving a deep, visible scuff mark on the polished mahogany surface. She leaned in uncomfortably close, her voice dripping with venomous, mocking condescension. She told Aaron to stop playing the silent, noble hero when he was completely, utterly powerless to change the inevitable outcome. She reminded him forcefully that vast amounts of money ruled the world and he simply did not possess any real power. Aaron placed his coffee mug down on the laminate counter with a soft, definitive clink. He reached into the deep pocket of his worn canvas jacket, pulled out his sleek smartphone, and tapped the bright screen. He dialed a saved number and pressed the loud speakerphone button, setting the device flat on the damaged wooden table. The line rang exactly twice before a sharp, hyper-professional voice answered the call, echoing clearly through the silent room. Rachel Thorne spoke briskly, stating she was standing by securely for his executive instructions. Aaron did not look at Evan. He locked his cold, unwavering, terrifying gaze directly onto Vanessa's smug, pale face. He instructed his powerful corporate lawyer to initiate Protocol C immediately. He ordered Rachel to begin the absolute financial execution, starting directly with the immediate closure of Vanessa's luxury fashion boutique. The rosy color instantly vanished from Vanessa's cheeks as profound confusion and sheer, unadulterated terror replaced her arrogant smirk. Evan stared at the phone in absolute, paralyzing bewilderment, completely unable to comprehend how his supposedly penniless father commanded a high-powered corporate attorney. The silent adjustment had officially broken the surface. The towering glass skyscraper dominated the downtown skyline, a gleaming monument to corporate power that reflected the harsh morning sun. Aaron parked his old Ford truck in the subterranean executive garage, stepping out into the pristine concrete vault reserved for the city elite. He bypassed the main lobby security checkpoints entirely, swiping a solid black keycard that granted him unrestricted access to the private elevator. The high-speed cab shot upward, stopping smoothly at the exclusive penthouse level. Aaron walked down the quiet marble-lined corridor and entered the corner executive suite of Rachel Thorne. Rachel was a razor-sharp corporate attorney who commanded the boardroom with absolute authority. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window waiting for him in a tailored charcoal suit. As Aaron took a seat in the rich leather chair opposite her massive mahogany desk, the heavy weight of his past settled over him. After his beloved wife Naomi passed away decades ago, Aaron channeled his profound grief into a relentless, calculated drive. He built a staggering commercial real estate empire from absolutely nothing, purchasing and developing properties, until he owned half the commercial blocks in the financial district. However, he fiercely refused to let his massive wealth spoil his only child. Aaron placed every single asset into an impenetrable blind trust, choosing to live a humble, quiet life in his original neighborhood. He designed this elaborate financial fortress to force Evan to build his own legacy through hard work rather than unearned inheritance. Evan believed his tech consulting firm was the sole source of the family wealth, completely oblivious to the fact that his father owned the very ground beneath his feet. Aaron had stayed in the shadows waiting for his son to mature, but that naive hope was now entirely dead. Rachel did not waste any time with pointless pleasantries. She immediately turned away from the panoramic window and spread a thick stack of financial forensic reports across the polished mahogany desk. The pristine white pages were covered in highlighted bank transfers, hidden corporate ledgers, and meticulously tracked routing numbers. Aaron leaned forward, his dark eyes scanning the undeniable evidence of absolute betrayal. Rachel explained with cold, surgical precision that Vanessa had been systematically bleeding Evan dry for the past 18 months. Using her position as the unofficial financial manager of Evan's household, she had been aggressively embezzling funds directly from his supposedly successful tech consulting firm. Vanessa created a complex web of phantom vendor invoices and inflated expense reports, siphoning massive amounts of capital right under Evan's arrogant, oblivious nose. She utilized his blind, foolish trust to drain his business accounts, masking her theft as necessary operational costs. However, her deep arrogance blinded her to the most crucial detail of her entire lavish lifestyle. She proudly operated a high-end luxury fashion boutique in the heart of the city's most expensive shopping district, using the store to project an image of supreme wealth and untouchable status. Rachel slid a certified commercial lease agreement across the desk, tapping the ownership signature line with her manicured fingernail. Vanessa had absolutely no idea that the towering commercial building housing her elite boutique was fully owned and operated by Crawford Investment Holdings. Every single rent check she paid using the money she stole from Evan went directly into Aaron corporate accounts. She was an unwitting tenant residing inside Aaron's impenetrable financial fortress. Aaron stared at the lease agreement, his face a mask of cold calculation. The very woman who mocked his faded canvas jacket was currently standing on property he completely controlled. The devastating financial autopsy did not end at the boutique. Rachel opened a secondary encrypted file on her laptop, projecting a sprawling transactional map onto the wall monitor. The digital web tracked the stolen money as it moved rapidly through a series of complex international channels. The forensic documents definitively traced the embezzled $500,000 straight out of Evan corporate accounts through Vanessa personal shell companies and directly into an offshore account located in the Cayman Islands. Rachel pointed to the final destination of the stolen capital, her voice dropping into a grave, serious tone. She dismantled the central pillar of Vanessa's entire victim narrative in one swift stroke. The stolen $500,000 was certainly not being saved to secure a bright, prosperous future for Vanessa's supposedly unborn child. The money was not sitting in a college fund or a safe family trust. Instead, every single stolen cent was being quietly funneled to a completely unknown recipient. The offshore account was strictly registered to a single individual simply named Dominic. Aaron scrutinized the unfamiliar name glowing brightly on the large screen, his sharp mind immediately working to connect the hidden dots. Vanessa had weaponized her supposed pregnancy to manipulate Evan into handing over total control of his business finances, claiming she was nesting and building a secure foundation for their growing family. In reality, she was methodically draining his life savings to fund a ghost hiding in a tropical tax haven. She had meticulously framed Aaliyah to remove the only legitimate heir from the equation, ensuring the massive flow of cash to Dominic would never be discovered or interrupted. Aaron realized the true depth of her sinister plotting. Vanessa was not simply a greedy, manipulative stepmother. She was a calculated, professional predator executing a highly coordinated financial heist. Rachel reached into the very bottom drawer of her heavy mahogany desk. She pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope provided by the elite private intelligence firm Aaron retained on a permanent retainer. She opened the flap and silently placed a crisp, high-resolution surveillance photograph directly onto the polished wood. The glossy image depicted a rugged, sharp-featured man sitting aggressively at a high-stakes poker table inside a lavish casino. Rachel tapped the photograph, stating clearly that Dominic was definitely not an anonymous offshore business partner or a distant relative managing an international investment portfolio. The private investigators had dug deeply into the buried, sealed archives of a rural county courthouse located 3 states away. Rachel produced a certified, highly authenticated government document, laying it carefully next to the casino photograph. She looked Aaron dead in the eye and delivered the fatal, world-shattering truth. Dominic was Vanessa's true legal current husband. The official divorce papers Vanessa claimed she filed over 5 years ago were entirely fraudulent. She had paid a corrupt paralegal to mock up fake dissolution documents to show Evan, but those papers were never actually submitted to the federal courts. The marriage between Evan and Vanessa was an absolute legally void sham. Vanessa was a practicing bigamist orchestrating an incredibly elaborate long con alongside her actual husband to bleed the Crawford family entirely dry. She was using Evan's desperate desire for a perfect family as the ultimate weapon to fund Dominic underground lifestyle. Aaron stared at the official marriage certificate, a dangerous icy calm washing over his entire body. The false foundation of Evan's life was built on criminal quicksand. Aaron now possessed the ultimate ammunition to trigger a completely devastating absolute collapse of Vanessa's entire world, and he intended to strike without mercy. Rachel's secure desktop chimed with an encrypted high-priority alert. She quickly scanned the incoming message and looked up, her expression turning deadly serious. Vanessa had just bypassed the standard emergency room protocols and checked herself directly into the VIP wing of St. Jude Medical Center on the opposite side of the city. Rachel detailed the insidious strategy unfolding in real time. Vanessa was aggressively demanding a certified medical diagnosis of a mild traumatic brain injury, citing the fabricated assault in the kitchen. She fully intended to file this certified medical document with the family court before the county clerks clocked out for the weekend. A verified brain injury report would give an emergency judge absolute legal justification to forcibly lock Aaliyah in a state juvenile detention facility immediately. Vanessa was moving swiftly to eliminate the only threat to her massive financial heist. Aaron absorbed this information with a cold and calculating intensity. He did not waste a single second expressing outrage or disbelief. He simply nodded to Rachel, acknowledging the severe urgency of the situation. He turned his back on the panoramic city skyline, walked out of the executive suite, and took the private elevator straight down to the subterranean garage. Aaron climbed into the cabin of his battered old Ford truck and ignited the heavy engine. He navigated through the dense afternoon traffic with aggressive precision, his hands gripping the worn steering wheel. The stakes had drastically escalated from a simple custody dispute to a desperate race against the clock. He had to physically intercept that medical certificate before Vanessa could weaponize the legal system against his innocent granddaughter. Aaron focused entirely on the road ahead, completely preparing to dismantle Vanessa's medical charade right at the source. He would not let her win today. Aaron arrived at the pristine glass facade of St. Jude Medical Center and strode purposefully through the sliding doors. The heavily guarded VIP wing normally required strict authorization, security clearance, and a verified patient invitation. The front desk administrators moved to block his path, judging his faded canvas jacket and heavy work boots as entirely inappropriate for the elite corridor. Aaron did not argue with the reception staff. He simply produced a solid black titanium card bearing the hospital's highest philanthropic insignia. Decades ago, Aaron had anonymously funded the construction of this exact neurological wing, securing permanent, unquestioned access to the entire medical campus. The head administrator recognized the extremely rare donor credential, instantly apologizing profusely while waving him straight through the secure double doors. Aaron walked silently down the hushed, carpeted hallway until he reached the final suite at the end of the corridor. He slipped smoothly into the shadowed alcove just outside Vanessa's slightly open door. From his concealed vantage point, he possessed a perfect view of the luxury medical suite. Vanessa sat propped up against the plush pillows, wearing a silk hospital gown, clutching her head in an exaggerated display of agony. Standing at the foot of her bed was the chief of neurology, a distinguished physician with an unyielding professional reputation. The doctor spoke with a firm, uncompromising tone, staring down at the tablet in his hands. He flatly refused to falsify a concussion report. He stated clearly that Vanessa's cranial scans, neurological reflexes, and physical examinations were absolutely perfect. He informed her that generating a fraudulent medical certificate for a non-existent brain injury was a severe violation of medical ethics and grounds for immediate license revocation. He firmly ordered her to discharge herself from the hospital without further delay. Aaron watched the trap perfectly align. Vanessa realized her carefully rehearsed performance was completely failing to sway the highly principled physician. The feigned expression of painful vulnerability instantly vanished from her face, replaced by a sharp, desperate panic. She knew that without the signed medical certificate, her entire strategy to imprison Aaliyah would collapse before the weekend court session. She threw the heavy blankets off her legs and lunged toward her expensive designer handbag resting on the bedside table. Her manicured hands dug frantically into the leather compartments. She pulled out a remarkably thick, tightly bound stack of crisp $100 bills. With a heavy sneer of pure entitlement, she tossed the massive bundle of cash directly onto the pristine white hospital sheets. She aggressively ordered the doctor to stop playing the righteous saint and write the damn traumatic brain injury diagnosis immediately. She stated confidently that every person in the city had a price, and she was more than willing to pay double his daily rate to secure the specific legal paperwork she required. She demanded he take the money, sign his name on the dotted line, and walk away quietly. Standing completely undetected in the shadowed alcove, Aaron reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved his smartphone. He activated the high-definition video camera and positioned the lens perfectly through the narrow gap in the doorway. He pressed record with a steady, uncompromising finger. He filmed the exact moment the thick stack of illegal bribe money hit the hospital bed. He captured the raw, unfiltered audio of Vanessa attempting to brazenly corrupt a medical professional to destroy a child's life. He held the camera perfectly still, documenting every single detail of her desperate, pathetic criminal extortion. The digital file preserved her complete moral bankruptcy in staggering, undeniable clarity. The tense standoff inside the luxury suite was abruptly interrupted by the sound of heavy, rapid footsteps echoing down the carpeted corridor. Aaron remained perfectly still in the shadowed alcove as Evan rushed past him, completely blind to his father's presence. Evan pushed forcefully through the heavy wooden door and barged straight into the medical room. He arrived at the exact second the thick stack of $100 bills landed squarely on the white hospital sheets. He stopped dead in his tracks, staring in absolute confusion at the massive pile of loose cash resting between his wife and the chief of neurology. All the color instantly drained from Vanessa's face as she realized her husband had just witnessed her blatantly offering a criminal bribe. However, her predatory survival instincts engaged with terrifying speed. In a fraction of a second, her expression morphed from aggressive entitlement to sheer, helpless terror. She instantly burst into violent, hysterical tears, collapsing dramatically back against the pillows. She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at the deeply shocked physician. She cried out to Evan, frantically claiming that the corrupt, heartless doctor was mercilessly refusing to treat her severe brain injury unless she paid a massive, under-the-table cash bribe. She sobbed loudly, weaving a pathetic lie about being extorted in her most vulnerable moment. Evan rushed immediately to her side, wrapping his arms around her, glaring furiously at the innocent doctor. Outside the room, Aaron slowly lowered his smartphone and pressed the stop button. A cold, victorious smile ghosted across his weathered face. He now held the ultimate, irrefutable video proof of her blatant perjury. The deadly trap had snapped fully shut, and Vanessa had absolutely no idea she was already completely caught. The harsh, freezing morning sun had barely crested the city skyline when the fallout from the hospital encounter reached Aaron's front porch. Evan had swallowed his wife's hysterical, fabricated story whole, choosing the comfortable lie over the difficult truth. Blinded by Vanessa's theatrical tears, Evan launched a devastating preemptive legal strike. At precisely 7 o'clock, heavy footsteps echoed on Aaron's wooden steps, followed by a sharp, authoritative knock. Aaron opened the door to find 2 process servers standing in the freezing morning air. They did not offer a greeting. They simply thrust a thick stack of legal documents into Aaron's hands and immediately walked back to their idling vehicle. Aaron adjusted his reading glasses and scanned the top page of the aggressive filing. It was an emergency temporary restraining order signed and stamped by a night court judge. Evan had weaponized his expensive legal team overnight. The documents contained a series of wild, entirely baseless accusations. Evan formally accused his father of plotting to kidnap Aaliyah and transport a minor across state lines. The injunction legally barred Aaron from coming within 500 feet of Evan Vanessa or any property associated with their names. Evan was utilizing the court system to paint his father as a dangerous, unstable threat. He sought to completely isolate Aaliyah, cutting off her only safe harbor before the permanent custody hearing could even take place. Aaron read the ridiculous kidnapping allegations without a single shift in his facial expression. He knew this piece of paper was merely the opening salvo in a highly coordinated attack. Evan was using his perceived financial dominance to bully the legal system into submission. Aaron calmly placed the restraining order on his kitchen counter, fully anticipating the vicious secondary strike that was inevitably coming his way. Exactly 1 hour after the process servers departed, a stark white government sedan pulled up to the curb. 2 Child Protective Services agents marched up the front walkway, their posture rigid and uncompromising. They were flanked by a uniformed city police officer, his hand resting casually near his utility belt. Evan had escalated his assault from a civil dispute to a state-sanctioned raid. The agents pounded on the door, demanding immediate entry under the pretense of an emergency child welfare check. Aaron unlocked the deadbolt and stepped aside, allowing the aggressive trio into his modest living room. The agents stepped inside, their eyes darting around the space loaded with heavy preconceived judgments. Evan had clearly planted a vivid narrative of a dilapidated, unsafe environment managed by a senile, impoverished old man. The agents expected to find squalor, neglect, and a terrified teenager. Instead, they found a spotless, perfectly organized home smelling faintly of fresh coffee and lemon polish. Aaliyah sat calmly at the dining table, finishing her morning reading. The lead CPS worker, a stern woman clutching a thick clipboard, announced they had received a credible, urgent report from a concerned, wealthy parent. She stated that Evan had accused Aaron of harboring an unstable runaway in unsanitary conditions. She declared their intention to forcefully remove the minor from the premises for her own protection. The uniformed officer took a step forward, anticipating a hostile defensive reaction from the homeowner. People usually screamed, cried, or physically resisted when the state arrived to take a child. Aaron did none of those things. He simply gestured toward the clean, floral armchairs in his living room, maintaining an aura of absolute, unbreakable calm that instantly unsettled the aggressive government intruders standing awkwardly in his hallway. Aaron did not raise his voice, nor did he display a single ounce of intimidation. He politely offered the bewildered government agents a cup of freshly brewed coffee. The sheer normalcy of his hospitality forced the aggressive CPS workers to pause and recalculate their approach. Aaron walked over to his heavy oak desk and retrieved a crisp, neatly organized manila folder. He handed the file directly to the lead agent. He did not plead his case with emotional arguments. He used cold, hard facts. The folder contained a pristine, comprehensive psychiatric evaluation of Aaliyah conducted by the top adolescent specialist in the city, proving she was perfectly stable and entirely free of any behavioral issues. Next, Aaron provided a stack of certified, fully funded bank statements. While he kept the massive scope of his blind trust completely hidden, the visible accounts proved an unshakable, rock-solid financial stability that far exceeded standard foster care requirements. Finally, Aaron presented a series of glowing character references, including a personally signed letter from the sitting city mayor detailing Aaron's decades of quiet, steadfast community service. The lead CPS worker adjusted her glasses, her eyes scanning the undeniable proof of Aaron's capability. The stark contrast between Evan's frantic, fabricated emergency report and the absolute documented reality of Aaron's home was impossible to ignore. The tension in the room evaporated instantly. The uniformed police officer relaxed his posture, stepping back toward the door. The agents realized immediately that they had been manipulated by a wealthy, vindictive father trying to use a state agency as his personal weapon. The lead worker closed her clipboard, offering Aaron a sincere, embarrassed apology for the unwarranted intrusion. Evan's aggressive raid had completely failed, neutralized by the quiet, undeniable power of meticulous, flawless preparation. The heavy front door had barely clicked shut behind the departing government agents when the sharp, shrill ring of the kitchen telephone pierced the quiet house. Aaron walked over to the wall-mounted receiver and lifted it to his ear. The voice on the other end belonged to the head principal of Aaliyah's highly exclusive preparatory school. The principal spoke with a strained, deeply apologetic tone, stating he was legally obligated to make this immediate notification. Vanessa had not spent her morning resting from her fabricated hospital ordeal. Instead, she had driven directly to the private school administrative offices. Acting under the authority of her current legal guardianship, Vanessa had formally submitted a highly damning, completely falsified toxicology report to the disciplinary board. The fraudulent medical document claimed Aaliyah had tested positive for a cocktail of severe illegal narcotics. The principal explained that the prestigious, elite institution operated under a strict zero-tolerance substance abuse policy. Based solely on the documentation provided by her legal stepmother, an emergency expulsion hearing was officially scheduled for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. The principal warned Aaron that the situation carried devastating legal weight. If the disciplinary board voted to expel Aaliyah based on the fraudulent narcotics charge, the school was mandated by state law to report the incident to juvenile criminal authorities. An expulsion would hand a family court judge the exact legal ammunition needed to mandate Aaliyah directly into a state-run lockdown juvenile facility. Vanessa had bypassed the police and the child welfare system, entirely opting to destroy the teenager's future through absolute academic assassination. The ultimate deadline was set. Aaron had less than 24 hours to intercept this vicious bureaucratic strike before the heavy iron doors of the juvenile justice system slammed shut on his innocent granddaughter forever. The mahogany boardroom of Aaliyah's elite preparatory school felt more like a tribunal than an educational facility. The long, polished table was lined with stern administrators, their faces hardened by strict zero-tolerance policies. At the head of the table, Vanessa delivered a masterclass in calculated grief. She clutched a lace-trimmed tissue, delicately dabbing at her dry eyes while weaving a horrifying, entirely fabricated narrative. She described Aaliyah as a deeply troubled, violent teenager spiraling rapidly into severe drug addiction. She painted herself as the desperate, exhausted stepmother who had tried absolutely everything to save the girl, only to be met with physical abuse and unhinged deceit. Evan sat rigidly beside his wife, his jaw clenched tight. He did not speak, but his silent, continuous nodding provided all the tragic validation the board required. He was willfully endorsing the academic and social execution of his own daughter to protect his new marriage. The school board chairman, an austere man in a tailored tweed suit, adjusted his silver spectacles. He expressed his deep, solemn condolences to Evan and Vanessa for their family's tragic ordeal, stating that the school could not risk the safety of its student body. The chairman reached into his breast pocket and produced a gold fountain pen. He aligned the formal expulsion order on the leather blotter in front of him. The document was an absolute death sentence for Aaliyah's future, legally paving the way for her forced institutionalization in a state facility. He unscrewed the cap of his pen, fully prepared to sign away a 16-year-old girl's entire life based on a stack of fraudulent toxicology reports. Before the gold nib of the fountain pen could touch the heavy parchment, the massive double doors of the boardroom swung open with a resounding, violent crash. The sudden noise echoed like a gunshot against the mahogany panels. Aaron stepped over the threshold, his posture radiating an unshakable, terrifying authority. He wore his faded canvas jacket like armor, standing in stark contrast to the sea of tailored suits occupying the room. He was immediately flanked by Rachel Thorne, whose icy professional demeanor signaled impending devastation. The school administrators gasped, half rising from their plush leather chairs in sheer outrage at the unauthorized intrusion. Aaron did not ask for permission to enter, nor did he offer a single word of apology for the interruption. He marched straight down the length of the conference table, his heavy work boots silencing the murmurs of protest. Evan jumped to his feet, his face flushing with arrogant fury, demanding that campus security remove his father from the premises. Aaron completely ignored his son's pathetic outburst. Reaching the center of the table, Aaron pulled a sleek cylindrical wireless speaker from his pocket. He placed it firmly on the polished wood, the heavy thump drawing every eye in the room. He retrieved his smartphone, his calloused thumbs moving with deliberate, practiced precision. Rachel stood silently beside him, her arms crossed, watching the color rapidly drain from Vanessa's perfectly contoured face. Aaron tapped the screen once, pairing the devices. He looked directly at the board chairman, his dark eyes burning with cold, absolute truth, and stated that the board needed to hear the genuine reality of the situation before signing a fraudulent document. Aaron pressed the play icon on his glowing screen. The crystal-clear audio from the hidden digital recorder instantly flooded the silent, tense boardroom. The administrators flinched as Vanessa's recorded voice shrieked through the high-definition speaker. It was not the soft, weeping tone of the victim sitting before them. It was a guttural, demonic roar of pure, unfiltered malice. The room listened in paralyzed horror as the recorded Vanessa hurled vile, degrading insults at Aaliyah. They heard the sharp, unmistakable crack of a violent slap, followed by the terrifying crash of shattering glass. Then came the most damning evidence of all. The audio captured Vanessa panting heavily, followed by the dull, sickening thud of her intentionally slamming her own face against the solid oak of the kitchen cabinet. Her recorded voice then dropped into a vicious, calculating sneer. She explicitly detailed her grand, malicious strategy to the terrified teenager. The board members heard Vanessa gleefully admit that locking Aaliyah in a state detention center would guarantee Evan's massive family trust fund would default entirely to her unborn child. She mocked Aaliyah confidently, declaring that Aaron was a penniless broke mechanic who could never afford to save her. The illusion of the caring, traumatized stepmother shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the conference table. The absolute silence that followed the recording was deafening. Every single administrator stared at Vanessa with undisguised, profound disgust. The carefully constructed lie she had weaponized against an innocent child was now completely exposed in front of the city academic elite. The board chairman stared at the gold fountain pen in his trembling hand as if it had suddenly turned into a venomous snake. His face flushed with deep professional embarrassment. Without a single word of hesitation, he grasped the official expulsion papers and ripped them cleanly in half, tossing the destroyed documents into the center of the table. He stood up, adjusted his suit jacket, and offered a profound, genuine apology directly to Aaron for almost participating in such a monstrous miscarriage of justice. Beside the table, Evan stared at his wife in sheer, unadulterated horror. The undeniable reality of the audio recording had finally pierced through his thick armor of arrogant denial. He looked at the woman he had married, suddenly realizing he was tethered to a ruthless, calculating predator who had framed his own daughter for financial gain. The humiliation did not break Vanessa. Instead, it pushed her into a state of feral, cornered desperation. She leaped out of her leather chair, knocking it backward onto the floor. Her eyes were wild, darting around the room with manic intensity. She completely abandoned the weeping victim persona, her face twisting into a mask of pure spite. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Aaron, her voice rising to a hysterical scream. She viciously reminded the entire room that regardless of the audio, she still held primary legal guardianship over Aaliyah according to the family court records. She swore on her life that Aaron had not won. With absolute venom, she vowed to bypass the local authorities entirely and legally transfer Aaliyah to a notoriously brutal, unregulated lockdown camp in Utah before the stroke of midnight. Vanessa did not waste another breath on the stunned school administrators. She spun on her expensive heels and stormed out of the mahogany boardroom, her heavy footsteps echoing sharply down the polished corridor. Her hands shook with unadulterated fury as she pulled her smartphone from her designer bag and dialed a highly secure, unlisted number. She completely bypassed normal psychological services, connecting directly with a ruthless private extraction company. These were highly paid, specialized mercenaries who operated in the dark, hired by wealthy parents to forcefully drag rebellious teenagers from their beds in the dead of night. Through the open doors of the boardroom, Aaron listened to Vanessa frantically barking orders into the phone. She demanded an immediate emergency extraction, screaming at the dispatcher to deploy a team to Aaron's address tonight. She paid double their exorbitant premium fee to secure a spot in a brutal, unregulated lockdown facility deep in the Utah desert. Aaron stepped out of the boardroom and looked down at the heavy steel watch on his wrist. The dial read 11 o'clock exactly. He had precisely 6 hours before the county family court closed its doors for the weekend. If he failed to officially strip Vanessa of her primary legal guardianship before 5 o'clock, she would retain absolute state authority over Aaliyah for the next 48 hours. During that weekend window, Vanessa's hired thugs possessed the complete legal right to break into his home, bind his granddaughter, and transport her across state lines. The ticking clock had officially started transforming a bureaucratic dispute into a desperate race for Aaliyah's physical safety. Aaron and Rachel sprinted to the subterranean parking garage and threw themselves into his battered Ford truck. Aaron pushed the heavy engine to its absolute limit, weaving aggressively through the congested midday city traffic until they reached the towering concrete structure of the county courthouse. They bypassed the slow-moving public elevators rushing up the stairwell to the family court filing division. The massive administrative room was a suffocating nightmare of bureaucratic stagnation. Dozens of frustrated citizens crowded the waiting area, clutching crumpled paperwork beneath harsh fluorescent lights. Rachel marched directly to the primary clerk window, presenting the emergency injunction alongside the devastating audio evidence. She demanded an immediate audience with the duty judge to sever the guardianship. The head clerk, a hardened woman shielded behind thick bulletproof plexiglass, barely glanced at the critical documents. She flatly rejected the emergency request, citing a massive, immovable 3-day administrative backlog. Rachel aggressively utilized her elite corporate legal standing, threatening severe litigation and quoting specific emergency statutes. It completely failed. The exhausted clerk was entirely immune to high-priced attorneys and their aggressive demands. She slid the paperwork back under the glass, stating coldly that the motion would be processed on Tuesday morning and not a single minute sooner. Evan's vast corporate wealth could easily grease the wheels of local precincts, but it meant absolutely nothing in this overcrowded state facility. Likewise, Aaron's faded canvas jacket and heavy work boots commanded no immediate respect or urgency from the overwhelmed desk staff. They were completely trapped behind an impenetrable wall of red tape, watching precious hours slip away while a team of mercenaries prepared to raid Aaron's home. Aaron realized instantly that standard legal channels would result in Aaliyah being shipped to a desert prison camp by nightfall. He turned his back on the plexiglass window and walked away from the crowded line, his face set in a mask of absolute, terrifying resolve. Rachel followed closely behind as Aaron bypassed the public waiting area, entirely marching directly toward a heavy set of mahogany doors, marked for restricted authorized personnel only. A uniformed bailiff stepped forward to block their path, but Aaron moved with such quiet, undeniable authority that the guard instinctively stepped aside. Aaron navigated the labyrinth of private judicial corridors until he reached the opulent chambers of the chief judge. He pushed the heavy oak door open without knocking. The drip-fed reality of Aaron's hidden empire landed heavily in the silent room. 40 years ago, long before he owned half the financial district, Aaron needed a hungry, brilliant, and utterly ruthless young attorney to secure his very first commercial property acquisition. That sharp young lawyer was Marcus Vance, the man who currently sat behind the massive judicial desk as the chief judge of the entire district. Vance looked up from his reading glasses, his stern expression instantly softening into a look of profound respect. He recognized the man who had fundamentally launched his entire legal career. Aaron did not waste time with nostalgic pleasantries. He walked straight to the desk, placed the encrypted USB drive beside the judge's gavel, and explained the ticking clock threatening his granddaughter. Bypassing every standard protocol and administrative procedure, Judge Vance plugged the drive into his secure terminal. He sat in absolute silence, listening to the horrific, undeniable audio of Vanessa intentionally smashing her own face and boasting about stealing the family trust fund. The audio file ended, leaving a heavy, toxic silence hanging in the judicial chambers. Judge Vance's face hardened into a mask of pure professional disgust. He did not ask for secondary evidence or opposing testimony. He reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a pristine emergency custody transfer mandate, and grabbed his heavy fountain pen. The digital clock on the mahogany wall read exactly 4:55 in the afternoon. With 5 minutes to spare before the absolute weekend deadline, Judge Vance signed his name with aggressive, sweeping strokes. His signature legally stripped Vanessa of all parental rights and granted permanent immediate emergency custody directly to Aaron. The legal shield was officially secured. Aaron grabbed the freshly stamped documents, thanked his old friend with a firm nod, and sprinted out of the courthouse. He jumped back into his truck tires, screaming against the asphalt as he raced back toward his quiet residential neighborhood. The winter sun was rapidly sinking below the tree line, casting long, dangerous shadows across the suburban streets. Aaron pushed the speedometer higher, dread pooling in his stomach as he turned onto his specific block. He slammed the brakes, bringing the heavy truck to a screeching halt. Idling directly in front of his driveway was a battered, windowless black van with out-of-state license plates. The extraction team had not waited for nightfall. Two massive, heavily muscled men dressed in dark tactical gear were already marching aggressively up Aaron's front walkway. They moved with the cold, mechanical precision of seasoned mercenaries. As Aaron threw open his truck door, he saw the lead man uncoiling a set of thick, heavy-duty plastic zip ties, fully preparing to drag Aaliyah out of her own home by brutal force. Aaron did not hesitate. He vaulted out of the cab of his Ford truck before the engine had fully died, his heavy boots hitting the pavement with aggressive force. He sprinted up the concrete walkway, intercepting the two massive mercenaries just as the lead man reached for the front doorknob. Aaron thrust the freshly stamped court injunction directly into the center of the mercenary's chest. He did not yell or lose his composure. He spoke with a lethal, icy calm, informing the hired thugs that the document bore the official seal of the chief judge, granting him immediate and total legal custody of Aaliyah. He stated clearly that stepping 1 foot over the threshold would instantly upgrade their civil extraction contract to a federal kidnapping charge. The lead mercenary sneered, shifting his weight to shove the older man aside, completely underestimating the trap closing around him. At that exact second, the wail of a police siren shattered the quiet suburban street. Rachel Thorne had utilized her elite legal connections on the ride over, dispatching a local patrol unit directly to Aaron's address. The black and white cruiser swerved sharply to the curb, its red and blue lights washing over the dark tactical gear of the extraction team. The mercenaries were highly paid professionals, not foolish martyrs willing to face federal prison time for a botched domestic dispute. Recognizing the absolute legal checkmate, the lead man dropped the thick plastic zip ties onto the porch. Without a single word, both men pivoted sharply, retreating to their windowless black van. They slammed the heavy doors and accelerated down the street, abandoning the illegal extraction entirely to avoid the approaching uniformed officers. Aaron stood his ground on the freezing porch, his broad shoulders blocking the doorway completely. A sharp, furious shriek tore through the bitter evening air, instantly shifting Aaron's attention away from the fleeing mercenaries. Parked half a block down the street, hidden under the canopy of a large oak tree, sat a sleek, luxury sedan. The tinted driver's side window rolled down violently. Vanessa leaned out, her face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She had parked from a safe distance to watch her hired thugs drag a terrified teenager out of her home, expecting a flawless, brutal victory. Instead, she watched Aaron dismantle her expensive illegal raid without throwing a single punch. Her carefully crafted facade of the elegant, wealthy executive wife was completely gone, replaced by the feral desperation of a cornered predator. She screamed at Aaron, her shrill voice echoing off the neighboring houses. She vowed to utterly destroy him in front of the family court judge during the permanent custody hearing scheduled for Friday morning. She openly mocked his temporary injunction, declaring it a pathetic, short-lived delay of the inevitable. Vanessa gripped the edge of her car window, her knuckles turning white, and aggressively reminded Aaron of her ultimate trump card. She insisted that no judge in the entire state would ever deny permanent custody to a grieving, loving stepmother currently carrying Evan's unborn heir. She claimed her tragic victim narrative and her glowing pregnancy would completely blind the jury to any of Aaron's desperate accusations. She swore she would take Aaliyah, drain Evan's accounts dry, and leave Aaron to rot in his decaying house. With a final venomous glare, she rolled up the tinted glass and sped away into the darkening neighborhood, deeply convinced her biological leverage made her legally invincible. Aaron locked the heavy front deadbolt, securing his home against the freezing night. The immediate physical danger had passed, but the defensive phase of his operation was officially over. Walking into his brightly lit kitchen, he shifted his mindset from shielding his granddaughter to orchestrating the total, absolute annihilation of Vanessa's criminal enterprise. Rachel Thorne sat at his dining table, a hot cup of coffee resting beside her open laptop. She had spent the entire afternoon finalizing the deep forensic audit of Evan's tech consulting firm, cutting through layers of complex corporate obfuscation. She turned her monitor toward Aaron, displaying a sprawling, undeniable map of illicit financial routing. The massive amounts of capital Vanessa had systematically embezzled did not simply sit dormant in a secure Cayman Islands offshore account. That tropical tax haven was merely a temporary relay station designed to wash the stolen funds clean. Rachel traced the digital money trail with her pen, revealing the true devastating destination of Evan's hard-earned wealth. The embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars bounced rapidly from the Caymans directly into a heavily encrypted account tied to an underground, highly illegal Las Vegas gambling ring. Vanessa was not just funding a secret life with her hidden husband, she was actively paying off massive, dangerous mafia debts accrued by Dominic. Her legal husband was a compulsive, degenerate gambler in deep with ruthless loan sharks. Vanessa had systematically weaponized Evan's blind trust and corporate success to act as a personal ATM for a violent criminal syndicate. She was bleeding the Crawford family dry simply to keep Dominic's legs from being broken by desert enforcers. Aaron stared at the digital ledger, analyzing the staggering depth of her parasitic betrayal. The financial autopsy proved Vanessa was backed into a lethal corner. A sharp, authoritative knock on the front door pulled Aaron away from the glowing forensic data. He walked cautiously back to the entryway, peering through the reinforced glass. A bonded, secure legal courier stood on the porch holding a rigid cardboard mailer. Aaron signed for the package, verifying his identity before breaking the heavy tamper-evident seal. He carried the parcel back to the dining table and pulled out a stack of officially subpoenaed medical records obtained directly from a private women's health clinic located in Seattle. Aaron adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the dense clinical terminology printed on the hospital letterhead. For months, Vanessa had successfully weaponized her supposed pregnancy, using the promise of a new heir to manipulate Evan into handing over total financial control and to frame Aaliyah as a dangerous, jealous threat to the baby. She paraded her maternal status as an impenetrable shield against any scrutiny. However, the indisputable medical documents resting on Aaron's table completely obliterated her entire foundation of lies. Aaron read the final surgical report signed by the attending Seattle physician exactly 5 years ago. Following a severe medical complication, Vanessa had undergone a complete, irreversible full hysterectomy. She was biologically incapable of carrying a child. The doctor's notes were absolute and legally binding. The supposed heir to Evan's tech fortune was nothing but a phantom, a calculated biological scam designed exclusively to accelerate her massive financial heist. The baby did not exist. Vanessa had faked ultrasounds, fabricated morning sickness, and orchestrated an elaborate illusion to solidify her absolute control over Evan's life. Aaron placed the medical file down onto the wood, possessing the final lethal weapon required to completely execute Vanessa in federal court. The brutal truth resting on Aaron's dining table marked the absolute end of his patience. Friday was still days away, but Aaron had no intention of waiting for a judge to validate his victory. He instructed Rachel Thorne to immediately begin constricting the financial oxygen sustaining Vanessa's lavish, deceitful lifestyle. The execution commenced at the absolute height of the afternoon shopping rush. Across town, in the most exclusive commercial district of the city, Vanessa's high-end fashion boutique was operating at peak capacity. The sprawling, pristine showroom was a monument to superficial luxury, filled with imported marble fixtures, crystal chandeliers, and racks of exorbitantly priced garments. Vanessa stood near the center display, holding a flute of sparkling champagne and laughing with a tight circle of wealthy political socialites. She was entirely in her element, basking in the unearned admiration of the city elite, projecting the flawless image of a highly successful executive wife. Her triumphant performance was abruptly shattered when the heavy glass doors of the boutique swung open with aggressive force. A coordinated team of 6 uniformed commercial security guards marched directly into the showroom. They bypassed the velvet ropes and the terrified greeters, fanning out with military precision to form a secure perimeter around the central checkout counter. The soft classical music playing over the sound system was suddenly drowned out by the harsh, heavy tread of their boots against the polished stone floor. The wealthy socialites froze, lowering their champagne flutes in stunned silence as the aggressive disruption completely hijacked the serene atmosphere. Vanessa lowered her glass, her perfectly contoured face tightening into a mask of furious indignation. She stepped forward, fully intending to verbally decimate the guards for daring to taint her pristine kingdom with their unwanted, heavy-handed presence. The lead property manager walked deliberately through the center of the security perimeter, holding a thick red-stamped legal folder. He wore a sharp charcoal suit and carried himself with the absolute uncompromising authority of a man acting on direct orders from Crawford Investment Holdings. Ignoring the outraged glares of the elite clientele, he stepped directly up to Vanessa and slammed the heavy folder onto the pristine glass display counter. The sharp crack echoed through the silent boutique, causing the socialites to physically flinch. He announced in a loud, incredibly clear voice that he was serving a notice of immediate, non-negotiable eviction. Vanessa stared at the documents, her face flushing with indignant rage. She demanded to know the legal grounds for such a ridiculous, insulting stunt. The property manager did not lower his voice. He cited a direct violation of the moral turpitude clause hidden deep within her commercial lease agreement. He stated unequivocally that the leaseholder was actively engaged in highly documented criminal financial fraud, rendering her occupancy null and void. The surrounding customers gasped, exchanging wide-eyed, scandalous whispers. The carefully constructed illusion of Vanessa's elite superiority began to crack under the severe public exposure. Vanessa threw a violent, explosive tantrum right in the middle of her own showroom. She slammed her hands against the glass counter, screaming at the top of her lungs. She ordered her trembling retail staff to dial emergency services immediately. She demanded they call the police to arrest the property manager for criminal trespassing, harassment, and public defamation. She swore loudly that her husband's massive corporate legal team would bankrupt the entire building management company before the day was over. The property manager simply crossed his arms, staring at her with cold, unwavering indifference. The humiliating spectacle was rapidly destroying Vanessa's social standing in real time. The wealthy socialites were no longer admiring her. They were actively stepping away, their eyes filled with judgment and morbid fascination. Desperate to salvage her shattered image and regain absolute dominance over the room, Vanessa decided to execute a display of overwhelming financial brute force. She reached furiously into her crocodile leather designer handbag and pulled out her heavy, solid metal platinum corporate card. She held the card up high arrogantly, declaring that she did not need to tolerate an insulting commercial lease from a corrupt management company. She announced to the entire room that she would simply purchase the entire commercial block outright in pure cash. She slammed the premium metal card onto the counter and aggressively ordered the property manager to run it through the boutique's main terminal for a massive non-refundable holding deposit. Unfazed by her theatrical posturing, the manager picked up the card and swiped it through the reader. The machine processed for 3 seconds before emitting a loud, harsh, unmistakable red decline beep. Vanessa scoffed loudly, blaming a pathetic bank security error. She dug back into her purse and threw 3 more premium credit cards onto the glass counter, demanding he try them all. The manager swiped the second card. Declined. He swiped the third. Declined. He ran the final piece of plastic. The machine flashed a bright red alert indicating the account had been forcefully closed by the primary financial institution. Every single line of credit Vanessa possessed was frozen solid. The absolute financial execution Aaron had ordered was now fully active. The harsh sequence of declining beeps completely silenced Vanessa's arrogant tirade. The wealthy socialites did not bother to hide their amusement anymore. They set their champagne flutes down on the nearest tables and swiftly exited the boutique, whispering furiously to each other about the spectacular, pathetic downfall they had just witnessed. Humiliated beyond measure, Vanessa snatched her useless stack of plastic off the glass counter and ran blindly toward the soundproof glass office in the back of the store. She slammed the heavy door behind her, sealing herself away from the judging eyes of her remaining staff. Her hands shook violently as she grabbed her smartphone and dialed Evan's private line. She was fully prepared to scream at him, demanding he immediately contact the bank and fix whatever ridiculous corporate error had frozen their accounts. The line rang twice before Evan answered. Vanessa opened her mouth to launch her vicious assault, but the words died in her throat. Evan's voice lacked its usual arrogant, dismissive bite. He sounded utterly hollow, as if the very life had been drained from his lungs. Before she could utter a single complaint about the boutique, Evan delivered a fatal world-ending blow. He confessed that his tech consulting firm was completely dead. The primary anonymous investor, the silent, invisible benefactor who had funded his entire operation from its inception, had just pulled all their capital without a single word of warning or explanation. Evan whispered through the phone with a terrifying broken clarity. He stated that the corporate accounts were totally empty, the payroll was bouncing, and they were officially irreversibly bankrupt. The financial fortress they believed made them invincible had collapsed into dust. The glossy headquarters of Evan's tech consulting firm had transformed into a scene of absolute suffocating panic. Evan stood frozen in the center of his expansive corner office, his expensive silk tie pulled loose around his neck as he stared blankly at the massive digital display mounted on the wall. His chief financial officer, a usually stoic man whose face was now pale and slick with nervous sweat, rapidly scrolled through a series of internal corporate ledgers. The CFO pointed a trembling finger at the glaring red numbers highlighting an unexplainable $500,000 deficit that had silently gutted their operational capital over the past 18 months. The primary anonymous investor pulling out was only the final devastating nail in the coffin. The core rot had been eating the company from the inside for a very long time. Evan demanded to know how such a staggering amount of money could vanish without triggering a single internal security alarm or triggering an external audit. The CFO brought up the specific digital signature tied to every single fraudulent outbound transfer. The authorization logs did not show a faceless international hacker or a rogue junior employee. Every illicit wire transfer, every fabricated vendor invoice, and every offshore funneling operation had been executed using a highly restricted executive tier access code. The secure code belonged exclusively to Vanessa. She had utilized her administrative privileges to systematically bleed his life's work completely dry. Evan stared at his wife's digital footprint on the screen, his chest heaving as the crushing weight of her betrayal collided with his arrogant manufactured reality. Without waiting for the CFO to offer another word of explanation or propose a damage control strategy, Evan snatched his car keys off the desk. He bolted out of the corporate suite, ignoring the frantic questions from his staff, and raced toward his luxury vehicle to aggressively confront the woman actively dismantling his empire. Evan burst through the heavy oak doors of his sprawling suburban estate, his voice echoing fiercely off the vaulted ceilings as he shouted Vanessa's name. He found her standing in the center of the master bedroom, surrounded by the expensive remnants of her shattered afternoon. Before Evan could even articulate the massive financial charges against her, Vanessa executed the most desperate calculated performance of her entire life. Recognizing the absolute fury radiating from her husband, she immediately collapsed onto the plush carpet. She curled her knees to her chest, bearing her perfectly manicured face in her hands, and unleashed a torrent of hysterical, hyperventilating sobs. Evan froze the raw anger in his throat, momentarily choked by her intense theatrical display. Through aggressive, breathless tears, Vanessa swore on the precious life of their unborn child that she was entirely innocent of the corporate theft. She spun a wild, venomous narrative, claiming with absolute conviction that Aaliyah had deliberately hacked into the home computer network. Vanessa insisted the teenager had stolen her executive password specifically to frame her, driven by a jealous, malicious desire to destroy their marriage and bankrupt the new family. She wept loudly, begging Evan to protect their fragile baby from his violent, vindictive daughter. The sheer magnitude of the lie should have been incredibly obvious to any rational observer, but Evan was not a rational man. He was a terrified, arrogant executive watching his entire kingdom burn to ash. Terrified of losing the perfect family illusion, he had sacrificed his own flesh and blood to build. Evan swallowed the absurd deception whole. He dropped to the floor beside his weeping wife, wrapping his arms around her trembling shoulders, fully choosing to blame his teenage daughter rather than face the monstrous reality of his spouse. A torrential, punishing downpour battered the city streets as Evan drove his luxury SUV recklessly through the flooded intersections toward his father's neighborhood. The storm raged against the windshield, perfectly mirroring the chaotic desperation consuming his mind. He pulled sharply into Aaron's modest driveway, ignoring the deep puddles as he threw open the car door and sprinted through the freezing rain. Evan bounded up the wooden steps and began pounding his fists violently against Aaron's reinforced front door. The heavy deadbolt clicked open, revealing Aaron standing tall and unbothered in the warm glow of the hallway. Evan did not posture with his usual arrogant superiority. Stripped of his wealth, his business, and his false pride, the broken executive literally collapsed onto his knees on the soaking wet porch. The freezing rain plastered his expensive suit to his skin as he looked up at the father he had mercilessly mocked just days prior. Evan pleaded with a pathetic, cracking voice. He begged Aaron to immediately list the family home on the market, to completely liquidate his meager mechanic's retirement pension, and to hand over every single available cent. Evan demanded his father sacrifice his entire livelihood to fix this catastrophic financial ruin, insisting it was the only way Evan could protect his pregnant wife and salvage their future. He shamelessly weaponized his supposedly unborn child sobbing into the rain that Aaron owed him this financial bailout as a duty to his legacy. Evan knelt on the very porch he had previously threatened to demolish with lawsuits, crying like a helpless child demanding salvation from the exact man he had conspired to destroy. He remained completely oblivious to the fact that Aaron orchestrated the entire collapse. Aaron stood perfectly still in the open doorway, staring down at the pathetic, soaking wet man groveling on the wooden planks. The torrential rain continued to beat down around them, but Aaron did not step aside to offer his son shelter. He felt absolutely no anger, no pity, and no sorrow. He felt only a profound, freezing disappointment at the hollow shell of a man Evan had chosen to become. Aaron observed his son prioritizing a manipulative predator over his own daughter, desperately clinging to a toxic illusion instead of taking genuine accountability. Without raising his voice above the roaring storm, Aaron reached into the inner pocket of his canvas jacket. He pulled out a thick, heavy black envelope perfectly sealed and completely unmarked. He did not offer a comforting word or a promise of salvation. He simply extended his large, calloused hand and dropped the premium envelope directly onto the puddle-soaked porch right in front of Evan's knees. Aaron instructed his son to open the seal, read the specific address printed on the card inside, and bring his wife to the exclusive Le Bernard restaurant at exactly 8 o'clock tonight. He stated with a deadly, uncompromising calm that if Evan wanted his financial bailout, they needed to show up on time and face the music. Before Evan could ask a single frantic question, Aaron stepped back into his warm, brightly lit home. He pulled the heavy front door shut, the solid deadbolt locking with a definitive final click. Evan was left kneeling alone in the freezing downpour, staring at the black envelope, completely unaware that tonight's dinner would be the site of his absolute destruction. Vanessa did not waste another breath on the stunned school administrators. She spun on her expensive heels and stormed out of the mahogany boardroom, her heavy footsteps echoing sharply down the polished corridor. She paced the hallway like a rabid animal, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the leather of her handbag. Her hands shook with unadulterated fury as she pulled her smartphone from her purse and dialed a highly secure unlisted number. She completely bypassed normal psychological services, connecting directly with a ruthless private extraction company. These were highly paid specialized mercenaries who operated in the dark, hired by wealthy parents to forcefully drag rebellious teenagers from their beds in the dead of night. Through the open doors of the boardroom, Aaron listened to Vanessa frantically barking orders into the phone. She demanded an immediate emergency extraction, screaming at the dispatcher to deploy a team to Aaron's address tonight. She paid double their exorbitant premium fee to secure a guaranteed spot in a brutal, unregulated lockdown facility deep in the Utah desert. Aaron knew exactly what these extraction teams did. They operated in a legal gray area, exploiting parental guardianship laws to kidnap teenagers, throwing them into unmarked vehicles, and shipping them to wilderness camps where abuse was rampant and oversight was non-existent. Aaron stepped out of the boardroom and looked down at the heavy steel watch on his wrist. The dial read exactly 11 in the morning. He had precisely 6 hours before the county family court closed its doors for the weekend. If he failed to officially strip Vanessa of her primary legal guardianship before 5 o'clock, she would retain absolute state authority over Aaliyah for the next 48 hours. During that massive weekend window, Vanessa's hired thugs possessed the complete legal right to break into his home, bind his granddaughter, and transport her across state lines. The ticking clock had officially started transforming a bureaucratic dispute into a desperate high-stakes race for Aaliyah's physical safety. Aaron and Rachel sprinted to the subterranean parking garage and threw themselves into his battered Ford truck. Aaron pushed the heavy engine to its absolute limit, weaving aggressively through the congested midday city traffic until they reached the towering concrete structure of the county courthouse. They bypassed the slow-moving public elevators, rushing up the stairwell to the family court filing division. The heavy double doors of the courthouse swung open to reveal a chaotic sea of desperate humanity. The massive administrative room was a suffocating nightmare of bureaucratic stagnation. Dozens of frustrated citizens crowded the waiting area, clutching crumpled paperwork beneath harsh fluorescent lights. Rachel marched directly to the primary clerk window, presenting the emergency injunction alongside the devastating audio evidence. She slapped her premium leather briefcase onto the counter, her voice laced with absolute corporate authority as she demanded an immediate audience with the duty judge to sever the guardianship. The head clerk, a hardened woman shielded behind thick bulletproof plexiglass, barely glanced at the critical documents. She flatly rejected the emergency request, citing a massive, immovable 3-day administrative backlog. Rachel aggressively utilized her elite corporate legal standing, threatening severe litigation and quoting specific emergency statutes. It completely failed. The exhausted clerk did not even blink at the display of high-priced legal intimidation. She had seen 1,000 angry lawyers before lunch and was entirely immune to their aggressive demands. She slid the paperwork back under the glass, stating coldly that the motion would be processed on Tuesday morning and not a single minute sooner. Evan's vast corporate wealth could easily grease the wheels of local precincts, but it meant absolutely nothing in this overcrowded state facility. Likewise, Aaron's faded canvas jacket and heavy work boots commanded no immediate respect or urgency from the overwhelmed desk staff. Every second spent arguing with the apathetic clerk was another second closer to the extraction team arriving at Aaron's front door. They were completely trapped behind an impenetrable wall of red tape, watching precious hours slip away. Aaron realized instantly that standard legal channels would result in Aaliyah being shipped to a desert prison camp by nightfall. He turned his back on the plexiglass window and walked away from the crowded line, his face set in a mask of absolute terrifying resolve. Rachel followed closely behind as Aaron bypassed the public waiting area, entirely marching directly toward a heavy set of mahogany doors marked for restricted authorized personnel only. A uniformed bailiff stepped forward to block their path, reaching for his radio, fully prepared to call for backup. Aaron's unwavering, stone-cold glare pinned the man in place. Aaron radiated a quiet, dangerous confidence that simply did not belong to a broke mechanic. He moved with such undeniable authority that the guard instinctively stepped aside, completely abandoning protocol. Aaron navigated the labyrinth of private judicial corridors until he reached the opulent chambers of the chief judge. He pushed the heavy oak door open without knocking. The drip-fed reality of Aaron's hidden empire landed heavily in the silent room. 40 years ago, long before he owned half the financial district, Aaron needed a hungry, brilliant, and utterly ruthless young attorney to secure his very first commercial property acquisition. That sharp young lawyer was Marcus Vance, the man who currently sat behind the massive judicial desk as the chief judge of the entire district. Judge Vance was a man feared by corporate litigators and local politicians alike, known for his uncompromising adherence to the letter of the law. Vance looked up from his reading glasses, his stern expression instantly softening into a look of profound respect. He recognized the man who had fundamentally launched his entire legal career. Aaron did not waste time with nostalgic pleasantries. He placed his weathered, calloused hands on the polished mahogany desk, looking directly into the eyes of the man he had mentored decades ago. He placed the encrypted USB drive beside the judge's gavel and explained the ticking clock threatening his granddaughter. Bypassing every standard protocol and administrative procedure, Judge Vance plugged the drive into his secure terminal. He sat in absolute silence, listening to the horrific, undeniable audio of Vanessa intentionally smashing her own face and boasting about stealing the family trust fund. The audio file ended, leaving a heavy, toxic silence hanging in the judicial chambers. Judge Vance's face hardened into a mask of pure professional disgust. He did not ask for secondary evidence or opposing testimony. He reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a pristine emergency custody transfer mandate, and grabbed his heavy fountain pen. The digital clock on the mahogany wall read exactly 4:55 in the afternoon. With 5 minutes to spare before the absolute weekend deadline, Judge Vance signed his name with aggressive, sweeping strokes. His signature legally stripped Vanessa of all parental rights and granted permanent immediate emergency custody directly to Aaron. The legal shield was officially secured. Aaron grabbed the freshly stamped documents, thanked his old friend with a firm nod, and sprinted out of the courthouse. He slammed the heavy documents onto the dashboard and threw the truck into gear, tearing out of the parking garage with the engine roaring. The tires screamed against the asphalt as he raced back toward his quiet residential neighborhood. The winter sun was rapidly sinking below the tree line, casting long, dangerous shadows across the suburban streets. The neighborhood, usually a haven of quiet domesticity, felt entirely sinister in the fading twilight. Aaron pushed the speedometer higher, dread pooling in his stomach as he turned onto his specific block. He slammed the brakes, bringing the heavy Ford to a screeching halt. The black van sat idling directly in front of his driveway like a predator waiting to strike its exhaust, pluming into the freezing evening air. The extraction team had not waited for nightfall. Two massive, heavily muscled men dressed in dark tactical gear were already marching aggressively up Aaron's front walkway. They did not look like medical professionals or counselors. They looked like hardened tactical operatives accustomed to violent resistance. They moved with the cold, mechanical precision of seasoned mercenaries. As Aaron threw open his truck door, he saw the lead man uncoiling a set of thick, heavy-duty plastic zip ties, fully preparing to drag Aaliyah out of her own home by brutal force. Aaron did not reach for a weapon, nor did he call for the police. He gripped the court order in his hand, fully prepared to tear the mercenaries apart if they took one more step toward his front door. The heavy, suffocating silence in the ultra-exclusive dining room of Le Bernard was absolute. The ambient noise of clinking crystal glasses and soft jazz seemed to evaporate completely, leaving a sterile vacuum around their private table. The solid metal, diamond-encrusted Centurion card rested on the pristine white tablecloth, gleaming sharply under the golden light of the overhead chandeliers. Vanessa stared at the impossible piece of plastic, her meticulously crafted mask of smug superiority shattering instantly. It was replaced by a raw, suffocating panic that drained the color completely from her perfectly contoured face. She simply could not comprehend how the supposedly penniless blue-collar mechanic she had relentlessly mocked possessed a financial artifact reserved exclusively for the global billionaire elite. Beside her, Evan sat completely paralyzed, his posture rigid and his jaw slack. His mind fiercely rejected the terrifying reality unfolding in front of him. He blinked rapidly, his breathing turning shallow and erratic as he stared at the rugged, calloused hands of the father he had openly despised. He desperately tried to reconcile the image of a grease-stained laborer with the ruthless titan of industry he had blindly worshipped and relied upon for the past decade. The anonymous investor who had funded his entire tech consulting firm, the invisible corporate giant who held absolute power over his financial existence, was the very man sitting calmly across the table sipping a perfectly aged vintage wine. Evan felt the physical weight of his own profound arrogance crushing his chest. Every condescending remark and every vicious insult hurled at Aaron now echoed in his mind as a fatal career-ending mistake. Aaron did not gloat or smirk. He simply watched them with cold, analytical precision, allowing the crushing gravity of their absolute ruin to settle over the dinner table. Aaron finished his wine and set the crystal glass down with a sharp, decisive clink against the table. He raised his right hand and snapped his fingers once. The sharp sound cut through the thick tension like a gunshot. From a shadowed private alcove just a few feet away, Rachel Thorne emerged. She was dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit, her expression radiating absolute professional devastation. She walked with measured predatory steps directly to their table, entirely ignoring the shocked stares of the surrounding wealthy patrons. Rachel did not offer a polite greeting. She simply raised a massive, densely packed stack of forensic banking records and dropped them with a heavy thud directly onto the fine bone china of Vanessa's dinner plate. The sudden impact rattled the expensive silverware. Aaron leaned forward, his voice completely devoid of warmth, and instructed Evan to look closely at the highlighted sections of the financial audit. Rachel stood silently behind Aaron, serving as the grim executioner of Vanessa's carefully constructed heist. The top documents clearly mapped the catastrophic hemorrhaging of Evan's corporate accounts. Every single illicit transfer was meticulously tracked and verified. The audit highlighted the missing $500,000 systematically siphoned from the tech firm, routed through a complex maze of Vanessa's private offshore shell accounts, and wired directly to a notorious underground gambling syndicate in Las Vegas. The money did not go to secure investments or overseas savings. It went straight into the pockets of ruthless Nevada loan sharks to settle the massive life-threatening mafia debts accumulated by Dominic. Vanessa had systematically leveraged Evan's blind trust to save her hidden husband's life. The undeniable paper trail exposed Vanessa not as a sophisticated executive wife, but as a desperate, reckless thief funding a violent criminal enterprise. Evan reached out with violently shaking hands and pulled the thick stack of financial documents toward him. His wide eyes darted frantically across the detailed spreadsheets, the offshore authorization codes, and the undeniable wire transfer receipts bearing Vanessa's secure digital signature. The reality of his absolute financial ruin was printed in bold, unforgiving ink. He looked up at Vanessa, his face a tragic portrait of shattered trust and desperate denial. He begged her to explain the unauthorized transfers, his voice cracking as he pleaded for a logical excuse. He wanted her to deny the massive theft, to claim it was a catastrophic accounting error or a sophisticated corporate hack by a rival firm. Vanessa sat frozen in her upholstered chair, her jaw trembling. She was entirely unable to formulate a single coherent lie under the crushing weight of Rachel's flawless forensic audit. Terrified of facing the monstrous truth about the woman he married, Evan completely fractured mentally. He fiercely rejected the reality of her malicious betrayal. He turned his frantic gaze back to Aaron, shouting across the quiet dining room and drawing the attention of the elite waitstaff. He desperately attempted to justify the missing $500,000, claiming Vanessa must have made a misguided, panicked mistake to secure a safe financial future for their growing family. He loudly defended her shattered honor, insisting she acted out of fierce maternal protection for their unborn baby. He weaponized the false pregnancy with pathetic conviction, desperately clinging to the very illusion Vanessa had used to manipulate him. He demanded his father ignore the corporate theft and show basic human compassion for his future grandchild. Evan was entirely willing to forgive his own financial devastation just to preserve the fragile, fabricated image of his perfect new family. Aaron did not raise his voice to match his son's pathetic, shouting desperation. He maintained an icy, unwavering calm that completely dominated the physical space around them. Aaron reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and retrieved the heavy, tamper-evident envelope delivered earlier that evening. He placed the sealed cardboard mailer onto the white tablecloth and slid it slowly across the smooth surface until it rested directly in front of Evan's shaking hands. Aaron instructed his son to open the package and carefully read the official subpoenaed clinical notes obtained from a highly secure private women's health clinic in Seattle. Aaron stated with lethal clarity that the medical documents were exactly 5 years old. Evan hesitated, his trembling fingers tearing open the heavy seal. He pulled out the official hospital records, his eyes scanning the dense, uncompromising medical terminology printed on the clinic's letterhead. The ambient noise of the restaurant completely vanished from his ears as he read the final surgical conclusion signed by the attending physician. The document explicitly detailed a severe medical emergency resulting in a full, irreversible hysterectomy. Evan stared at the word hysterectomy, printed in stark black ink. He read it a second time, his mind violently struggling to process the devastating absolute finality of the diagnosis. The horrific realization hit him with the physical force of a freight train. The pregnancy was a biological impossibility. The heir he had been fiercely protecting, the unborn baby Vanessa used to steal his company and exile his teenage daughter, simply did not exist. It was a phantom designed entirely for ruthless financial extortion. Evan slowly lifted his head, his eyes locking onto his wife with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. Realizing her ultimate foundational lie had been entirely destroyed, Vanessa leaped to her feet. The violent, sudden movement sent her heavy dining chair crashing backward onto the polished hardwood floor. The heavy oak chair struck the polished mahogany floor of Le Bernard with a violent, echoing crack that instantly silenced the surrounding tables. Vanessa stood over the pristine white tablecloth, her chest heaving as the absolute reality of her exposed deception settled into her bones. The terrified, weeping victim persona evaporated in a single heartbeat, instantly replaced by the feral, cornered desperation of a rabid animal. She did not attempt to deny the surgical records sitting in front of her shattered husband. She completely abandoned the illusion of the loving, expectant mother. Instead, she leaned over the table, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the fine linen, and unleashed a guttural shriek of pure malice directly into Evan's face. She viciously mocked his absolute staggering gullibility, labeling him a pathetic, insecure fool who practically begged to be robbed blind. She detailed exactly how easy it had been to manipulate his massive ego, stroking his vanity, while systematically bleeding his tech empire dry right beneath his nose. She laughed at the notion that a man so desperate for a perfect corporate family could be so easily blinded by fake ultrasound printouts and fabricated morning sickness. Evan sat paralyzed in his tailored suit, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound, as the woman he loved violently dismantled his entire sense of manhood. Vanessa commanded the silent dining room, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch, as she declared Evan was nothing more than an arrogant, spineless stepping stone for her ultimate financial security. Having thoroughly decimated her husband, Vanessa snapped her furious gaze toward the man sitting calmly at the head of the table. Her rage burned with a toxic, unchecked intensity as she realized a man she considered entirely beneath her had flawlessly dismantled her masterfully crafted heist. She unleashed a torrential flood of vile, unforgivable racial slurs directly at Aaron, her unhinged bigotry echoing sharply off the crystal chandeliers above. She screamed that a blue-collar black mechanic had absolutely no right to sit in a Michelin-starred dining room, much less dictate the terms of her financial survival. She spat venomous, degrading insults, furious that someone of his background possessed the intellect and resources to outmaneuver her elite corporate strategy. Her hatred then pivoted violently toward Aaliyah. Vanessa loudly assassinated the teenager's character, calling her a worthless feral delinquent who belonged in a desert lockdown camp. The sheer volume and horrific nature of her racist tirade completely shattered the refined decorum of the ultra-rich enclave. The surrounding diners, prominent socialites, and corporate titans did not intervene to calm the situation. Instead, dozens of smartphones were raised across the room, recording every single vile word escaping Vanessa's mouth in high-definition video. Her entire professional and social standing was being live-streamed to the city elite, permanently cementing her absolute public ruin. Vanessa ignored the glowing lenses capturing her breakdown, entirely consumed by her blind, destructive rage against the man who had just severed her golden parachute. Aaron remained an immovable mountain of stone amidst the hysterical chaos erupting across the table. He did not rise to his feet. He did not raise his voice to defend himself or his granddaughter against the barrage of venomous bigotry. He simply lifted his crystal glass of vintage Burgundy, took a slow, deliberate sip, and watched the predator incinerate her own life. His silence was a weapon far more devastating than any retaliatory shouting match could ever be. He operated as a cold, analytical observer, watching a failed biological experiment destroy itself. Beside Vanessa, Evan finally broke. The overwhelming weight of his colossal failures crashed down upon his shoulders, crushing his spine and forcing him to fold forward. He buried his face deep into his trembling hands, unleashing a raw, agonizing sob that tore through his chest. Evan realized with absolute terrifying clarity that he had willingly sacrificed his own flesh and blood to protect a monster. He had allowed his innocent teenage daughter to be framed, abused, and nearly shipped off to a brutal wilderness camp, all to appease a ruthless parasite who viewed him as nothing more than a gullible bank account. He was entirely bankrupt financially, morally, and spiritually. He wept openly over the white tablecloth, his tailored suit hanging off his shaking frame like a discarded rag. Aaron looked down at his weeping son without a single trace of paternal sympathy, letting the brutal consequences of Evan's profound arrogance completely break him. Realizing that her hysterical screaming had absolutely no emotional impact on Aaron's terrifying calm, Vanessa abruptly stopped. Her chest heaved as she smoothed down the front of her designer dress, attempting to reclaim a fraction of her shattered dignity. She snatched her expensive leather handbag from the neighboring chair and pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly between Aaron's eyes. She abandoned the physical attack and shifted immediately to a declaration of total legal warfare. Vanessa loudly promised the entire dining room that she was still legally married to Evan, cementing her absolute right to half of his corporate assets and properties. She swore with venomous conviction that she would drag the Crawford family through the most vicious, highly publicized divorce trial this city had ever seen. She vowed to deploy top-tier litigators tomorrow morning to extract millions in alimony and completely annihilate the Crawford name in family court, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband's accounts were currently holding negative balances controlled entirely by Aaron's investment firm. She turned her back on the ruined men, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she prepared to storm out of the double-glass doors and contact her attorneys. Aaron set his wine glass down on the table, folding his heavy hands together. He looked directly at her, retreating back, his voice slicing cleanly through the ambient murmurs of the restaurant. He simply replied, "I look forward to it." The air inside the county family courthouse was thick with suffocating tension. Friday morning had arrived, bringing the brutal legal showdown Vanessa had so arrogantly promised. She sat at the plaintiff's table wearing a pristine, understated white suit designed to project the ultimate image of innocent victimization. Beside her paced her aggressively expensive litigator, a notoriously vicious shark named Gregory Sterling. Sterling commanded the courtroom floor, projecting his booming voice toward the high ceiling as he delivered a masterful, entirely fabricated theatrical performance. He painted Aaron Crawford not as a concerned grandfather, but as a tyrannical, vindictive corporate patriarch who had illegally hijacked his son's tech empire. Sterling marched back and forth, gesturing wildly toward Vanessa, as he described a helpless, devoted wife deliberately starved of her rightful financial resources by a malicious billionaire. He demanded immediate and total liquidation of the Crawford corporate assets to secure emergency spousal support and a 50% division of the marital estate. Refusing to yield a single inch, Sterling then pivoted his vicious assault toward Aaliyah. He demanded the judge immediately reinstate Vanessa's primary guardianship, insisting that the teenager was a violent, disturbed delinquent who required immediate placement in the Utah lockdown facility for the safety of everyone involved. Sterling leaned heavily against the wooden podium, glaring at Aaron with absolute disdain. He demanded the court punish Aaron for his gross financial overreach and restore Vanessa to her rightful place of wealth and authority. Rachel Thorne did not react to the thunderous accusations. When the judge finally turned his weary gaze toward the defense table, Rachel stood up slowly, her posture radiating an absolute terrifying calm. She did not signal for paralegals to wheel in massive cardboard boxes of financial evidence. She did not prepare a fiery, dramatic rebuttal to dismantle Sterling's highly emotional narrative. Instead, she stepped out from the private alcove holding nothing but a single, incredibly thin manila file folder. The stark contrast between Sterling's frantic, sweating theatricality and Rachel's lethal, icy professionalism immediately shifted the entire gravity of the courtroom. She walked to the center aisle, her high heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. Rachel addressed the judge with a smooth, unwavering tone, completely ignoring the opposing counsel. She stated that before the court could possibly entertain any demands for spousal support, asset liquidation, or property division, they first needed to establish the foundational legal standing of the plaintiff. She requested formal permission to submit one single piece of evidence regarding the absolute validity of the marriage in question. Sterling crossed his arms and scoffed loudly, attempting to dismiss her calm demeanor as a pathetic stalling tactic. Rachel did not spare him a single glance. She maintained unwavering eye contact with the judge, declaring that this single document would render every single demand made by the plaintiff completely null and void. The judge granted the request with a sharp nod. Rachel approached the high wooden bench and handed over a pristine, certified document encased in a clear protective sleeve. She provided a secondary copy to the bailiff, who promptly delivered it to the plaintiff's table. Sterling snatched the paper up, a smug, triumphant sneer plastered across his face. He glanced at the bold heading and laughed out loud, his voice echoing with arrogant superiority. He loudly informed the court that the defense had simply provided a certified marriage license from the state of Nevada. Sterling aggressively mocked Rachel, claiming that submitting his client's official marriage certificate only concretely proved Vanessa's absolute legal right to Evan's money and assets. Rachel stood perfectly still, allowing his arrogant laughter to fill the room before she struck the fatal blow. She smoothed her tailored suit jacket and corrected him with a voice like shattering glass. She advised Sterling to actually read the fine print. Rachel pointed out that the certified document was exactly 7 years old. She instructed the judge to read the name of the groom printed clearly on the legally binding certificate. The groom was not Evan Crawford. The signature belonged to a man named Dominic. The color instantly drained from Sterling's face as his smug superiority completely evaporated. Vanessa was legally married to another man in Nevada long before she ever met Evan. Her union with the Crawford family was outright bigamy, completely illegal and entirely fraudulent. The courtroom plunged into a state of absolute paralyzed shock. Sterling dropped the paper onto the table as if it had suddenly caught fire, realizing instantly that a fraudulent marriage meant Vanessa had zero legal claim to a single dime of Evan's wealth. No alimony, no property division, no marital rights. Vanessa gripped the heavy edge of the oak defense table, her knuckles turning bone white as pure, unadulterated terror seized her lungs. Rachel Thorne did not give them a single second to recover from the devastating legal ambush. She turned gracefully toward the armed bailiff standing by the entrance and formally called her first and only witness to the stand. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding thud. A rough-looking man stepped over the threshold wearing a cheap, deeply wrinkled suit that hung awkwardly on his frame. His face was bruised, and his posture practically screamed of underground gambling dens and unpaid mafia debts. Dominic walked slowly down the center aisle, his eyes darting nervously around the imposing judicial environment. Aaron had utilized his vast corporate resources to locate the desperate, indebted gambler and physically drag him out of Las Vegas to testify. Dominic approached the wooden witness box and raised his right hand to be sworn in. Vanessa stared at her secret legal husband, her eyes wide with sheer horror. She looked as though she had just seen a ghost rise from the grave. The absolute financial and legal annihilation of Vanessa was now fully underway. Dominic adjusted his collar, looking entirely out of place in the pristine judicial setting. He did not look at Vanessa. He stared straight ahead at the judge. Rachel Thorne approached the podium, her voice slicing through the heavy silence. She asked Dominic to state his full name and his relationship to the plaintiff. Dominic cleared his throat and explicitly identified Vanessa as his current legally bound wife. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Sterling Vanessa's high-priced attorney sank slowly into his leather chair, realizing his case was entirely unsalvageable. Rachel methodically guided Dominic through his testimony. He explained with the exhausted resignation of a man who had already lost everything that he had recently accepted a comprehensive federal plea deal regarding his extensive illegal gambling operations. In exchange for full immunity from the federal syndicate charges, he agreed to expose the entire extortion ring. He testified under oath that the marriage to Evan Crawford was never a union of love or even a desperate mistake. It was a highly calculated, meticulously orchestrated scam designed from the very beginning to infiltrate and drain the Crawford corporate accounts. Dominic detailed how they researched Evan, exploiting his massive ego and deep-seated insecurities about his family image. Vanessa had positioned herself as the perfect corporate trophy wife, a Trojan horse designed to secure executive access to Evan's wealth. Every wire transfer, every offshore funneling operation, and every fabricated vendor invoice had been pre-planned to funnel Evan's money directly into the pockets of Dominic's ruthless loan sharks. Evan sat frozen in the gallery, listening to the brutal mechanics of his own financial execution. His entire life had been nothing more than a profitable mark for two desperate con artists. Rachel Thorne did not let the momentum stall for a single second. She paced in front of the witness box, demanding Dominic clarify the extreme measures Vanessa took to maintain absolute control over Evan's fortune. Dominic wiped sweat from his brow and confirmed the most devastating layer of the deception. He testified that the pregnancy was an entirely fabricated tool for emotional extortion. Vanessa knew Evan was desperately eager to solidify his manufactured image of a flawless family, so she weaponized a phantom child to blind him to the missing funds. Evan let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, his chest caving inward as the final shreds of his false reality burned away. Dominic then shifted to the subject of Aaliyah, explaining why the teenager had to be brutally exiled. He admitted that Vanessa viewed Aaliyah as the only legitimate threat to the Crawford fortune. As the sole blood heir, the teenager was a massive financial obstacle that had to be permanently removed. Dominic looked directly at the judge and stated that Vanessa intentionally slammed her own face into the heavy oak kitchen cabinet. She orchestrated the violent injury to frame her stepdaughter, knowing Evan would instantly prioritize his pregnant wife over his rebellious child. She had willingly destroyed the bond between a father and daughter simply to secure unfettered access to the corporate trust fund. Every single cruel accusation against the teenager, every tearful plea for protection, and every frantic call to the Utah lockdown facility had been a calculated maneuver to eliminate the rightful heir. Aaron watched from the defense table, his jaw clenched tight as the monstrous depth of Vanessa's cruelty was fully laid bare before the court. Stripped of her leverage, her lies, and her stolen wealth, Vanessa completely shattered. The polished facade of the elite corporate wife evaporated in a volatile explosion of primal rage. She let out an ear-piercing guttural shriek that rattled the high windows of the courtroom. Vanessa vaulted over the heavy mahogany plaintiff's table, sending expensive legal briefs and crystal water pitchers crashing to the marble floor. She lunged violently across the courtroom, her hands curled into claws as she aimed directly for Dominic's face. She screamed that he was a pathetic coward, a useless failure who had ruined everything they built. She hurled vicious obscenities, fully intending to tear him apart on the witness stand. Dominic threw his arms up to shield his face, but he did not need to defend himself. Two heavily armored court bailiffs intercepted Vanessa mid-stride. They tackled her with uncompromising force, driving her body hard onto the polished floor. The impact echoed like a gunshot. Vanessa thrashed wildly like a trapped animal, kicking and biting as the officers pinned her arms forcefully behind her back. Judge Vance stood abruptly, his face flushed with absolute fury. He struck his heavy wooden gavel repeatedly against the sound block, the sharp cracks cutting through Vanessa's hysterical screaming. He roared for order in his courtroom, demanding the bailiffs secure the aggressive plaintiff immediately. Sterling grabbed his leather briefcase and backed away from the chaotic scene, entirely abandoning his unhinged client to save his own professional reputation. Vanessa's venomous shrieks morphed into desperate, hyperventilating sobs as her face was pressed firmly against the cold marble, her total ruin playing out in the center of the judicial floor. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around Vanessa's wrists echoed with absolute finality. Judge Vance did not wait for the room to fully quiet down before delivering his uncompromising verdict. Disgusted by the sheer magnitude of the fraud and the violent outburst, he issued an immediate bench warrant for Vanessa's arrest on multiple felony charges, including massive grand larceny, perjury, and child endangerment. The bailiffs hauled the struggling, weeping woman to her feet and dragged her aggressively through the side doors, her hysterical protests fading down the restricted holding corridors. Judge Vance then turned his stern gaze back to the official documents on his desk. He struck his gavel once more, formally declaring the marriage between Evan Crawford and Vanessa completely null and void. He legally dismantled her entire claim to the corporate assets and swiftly rejected every motion filed by her disgraced attorney. Without a shred of hesitation, Judge Vance ruled on the safety of the minor, granting Aaron Crawford full permanent legal custody of Aaliyah, fully severing Evan's parental rights. Aaron stood up, buttoning his faded canvas jacket, having successfully executed the total dismantling of a predator without ever raising his voice. He nodded respectfully to the judge and walked out of the courtroom, his absolute authority completely restored. Evan remained slumped in the wooden gallery pews, entirely abandoned by the spectacle. He stared at the empty space where his wife had just been violently restrained. Stripped of his marriage, locked out of his bankrupt company, and legally severed from his only child, Evan sat alone in the chilling silence, facing the devastating ashes of his manufactured empire. The evening sky unleashed a torrential, punishing downpour, transforming the quiet suburban streets into rushing rivers of freezing water. Evan trudged up the cracked concrete driveway of Aaron's modest home, his expensive Italian leather shoes squelching in the deep mud. He possessed absolutely none of the swaggering, arrogant superiority that had defined his existence just 48 hours prior. His custom-tailored charcoal suit, once a flawless armor of corporate intimidation, clung to his shivering frame like a heavy, sodden rag. The icy rain plastered his hair to his forehead and mixed with the bitter tears streaming down his pallid face. He dragged his feet up the wooden steps of the porch, the same steps he had aggressively stomped upon when demanding his father liquidate his retirement fund to save Vanessa's fabricated empire. Now stripped entirely of his wealth, his manufactured family, and his towering pride, Evan was nothing more than a hollow shell seeking shelter from the storm he had created. He stood before the reinforced oak door, his chest heaving as the freezing wind battered his spine. He raised a trembling, numb fist and knocked weakly against the solid wood. The sound was pathetic, entirely devoid of demand or entitlement. It was the desperate tap of a ruined man begging for a sanctuary he had spent a decade mocking and trying to destroy. He wrapped his arms around his own torso, his teeth chattering violently, entirely dependent on the mercy of the father he had so brutally discarded for the illusion of corporate perfection. The heavy deadbolt clicked, and the thick wooden door swung open to reveal Aaron standing in the warm, inviting glow of the hallway. Aaron wore his usual faded flannel shirt and denim jeans, his posture radiating a quiet, unshakable strength. He looked down at the soaked, shivering wreckage of his son. The sheer humiliation of the moment completely broke Evan's remaining physical resolve. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed onto his knees on the wet wooden planks, splashing freezing rainwater across Aaron's work boots. Evan tilted his head back, unleashing a torrent of pathetic, breathless apologies that echoed over the roaring storm. He begged for Aaron to reinstate his executive position at the firm, pleading for a high-interest loan or a minor consulting role just to keep his bank accounts from plummeting into total foreclosure. He scrambled to justify his catastrophic blindness, shouting frantically that Vanessa was a predatory monster who had hypnotized him with the promise of a perfect legacy. He swore with desperate, tear-soaked conviction that he was finally ready to be a genuine father to Aaliyah. He promised to dedicate his entire ruined life to making amends, begging for the opportunity to move into Aaron's spare bedroom and rebuild their fractured family unit. He clutched at the hem of Aaron's jeans, a cornered executive fully willing to sacrifice his last shred of dignity for a financial and emotional bailout from the exact man he had systematically tried to erase from his upscale life. Aaron did not kick his son away, nor did he reach down to pull him out of the freezing rain. He stood perfectly still, looking down at the groveling man with eyes filled with heavy, crushing sorrow. There was no fiery vindication or triumphant gloating in Aaron's expression, only the profound, unbreakable resolve of a patriarch who had already made his final decision. Aaron spoke, his deep voice slicing cleanly through the chaotic drumming of the downpour. He stated clearly that as a father he forgave Evan for his arrogant blindness and his decade of disrespect. He held no personal malice in his heart for the insults hurled at his blue-collar life. However, Aaron's tone shifted, hardening into cold, uncompromising steel. He declared that as the legal guardian of Aaliyah and the supreme stakeholder of the corporate trust, he viewed Evan as a catastrophic, unforgivable failure. Aaron systematically dismantled Evan's desperate excuses, pointing out that Evan did not merely fall victim to a clever scam. Evan had actively chosen to prioritize a fabricated, status-obsessed lie over the physical and psychological safety of his own teenage daughter. Aaron reminded him with brutal clarity that Evan was entirely willing to let mercenaries drag Aaliyah away to a desert prison camp just to protect a phantom pregnancy. He stated that a man who sacrifices his own flesh and blood to preserve his corporate vanity fundamentally lacks the basic moral foundation required to be a father, a business partner, or a trusted member of any family. Evan wept louder, his frantic hands reaching out for a lifeline that was rapidly slipping away. He begged for a single chance to prove his newly discovered loyalty. Aaron shook his head slowly, fully rejecting the desperate plea for a comfortable rescue. He informed his son that there would be no secret corporate bailouts, no emergency trust fund allocations, and absolutely no room in his modest home for a man who refused to face reality. Aaron issued his final uncompromising directive. He ordered Evan to contact a public defender on Monday morning, formally file for total personal bankruptcy, and liquidate whatever pathetic remnants of his life remained. He told Evan to strip off the ruined designer suit, find brutal, exhausting manual labor, and slowly earn his way back into society from the absolute bottom. Aaron declared that respect and redemption could not be transferred through a bank wire. They had to be forged through genuine suffering and relentless hard work. Without waiting for Evan to utter another pathetic excuse or beg for a final reprieve, Aaron stepped backward into the warm, illuminated hallway. He grasped the heavy brass handle of the front door and pulled it shut. The solid deadbolt slid into place with a sharp, definitive click that signaled the absolute end of Evan's privileged existence. The porch light flicked off, plunging the space into darkness. Evan was left kneeling entirely alone on the freezing, flooded wooden planks, the punishing storm violently washing over him as he was finally forced to face the devastating consequences of his own monumental hubris. Several weeks dissolved into the sterile, unforgiving machinery of the state criminal justice system. The torrential rain of Evan's eviction had long since dried, replaced by the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of the county criminal courthouse. Vanessa stood at the heavy defense table, a hollow, degraded ghost of the elite corporate socialite she had relentlessly projected. The designer silk suits, the flawless contouring makeup, and the meticulously styled hair had been completely stripped away by the brutal reality of county lockup. She wore a stiff, oversized orange jumpsuit that swallowed her frame, her dark roots showing starkly against her faded blonde dye. Her hands, previously adorned with diamond rings purchased through grand larceny, were locked firmly in heavy steel cuffs chained to a leather restraint belt at her waist. She shifted her weight nervously from foot to foot, the cheap rubber soles of her institutional shoes squeaking against the scuffed linoleum floor. The presiding judge, a severe woman with a reputation for uncompromising sentencing, adjusted her reading glasses and sorted through the massive, devastating prosecution file. The courtroom air felt thick and suffocating as the judge read the extensive list of felony charges onto the official public record. The litany of crimes echoed relentlessly off the bare concrete walls. Grand larceny for the systematic theft of $500,000 from a corporate entity. Felony bigamy for orchestrating a fraudulent marriage while legally bound to a known federal criminal. Child endangerment for maliciously manipulating state authorities to force an innocent teenager into an unregulated abusive wilderness facility. Vanessa stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched tight as the sheer magnitude of her calculated destruction was laid entirely bare before the court. The gavel rested silently on the sound block, waiting to deliver absolute finality. Desperation clawed at the edges of Vanessa's fractured sanity as the judge prepared to formally deliver the sentencing mandate. Refusing to accept her total isolation, Vanessa twisted her torso against the heavy chains and scanned the public gallery with wild, frantic eyes. She searched the polished wooden pews for a single familiar face to validate her existence. She actively hunted for Evan. Despite financially ruining him and publicly assassinating his manhood, a dark, manipulative corner of her mind truly believed her former Mark would show up. She had spent an entire decade flawlessly conditioning him to cater to her every whim, molding him into a subservient, gullible provider. She genuinely expected him to walk through the double doors, clutching a tear-stained letter of leniency, begging the judge to show mercy on the woman he once loved. She hoped his pathetic desperation to maintain the illusion of a family would force him to offer a shred of sympathy or a plea for a reduced sentence. Her eyes darted frantically across the rows of spectators, local reporters, and off-duty court clerks. The seats directly behind the defense table, traditionally reserved for immediate family and character witnesses, were entirely empty. A profound, chilling void occupied the space where her engineered support system should have been. Evan never showed up. The man she had systematically bankrupted and humiliated had finally severed the psychological leash. He was entirely gone, vanished into the manual labor and personal bankruptcy Aaron had mandated. The crushing realization slammed into Vanessa with the physical force of a concrete wall. She was absolutely alone. The charming predatory facade had failed completely, leaving her with no victims to manipulate, no wealth to leverage, and absolutely no one left to answer her desperate calls for salvation. Directly across the aisle, occupying the very front row of the prosecution's gallery, sat the only two people who had survived Vanessa's reign of terror. Aaron Crawford sat tall and unmoving, wearing a clean pressed canvas jacket, his large hands resting calmly on his knees. Beside him sat Aaliyah. The transformation of the young teenager was nothing short of miraculous. She was no longer the terrified, hyperventilating girl shaking violently in the sterile interrogation room of the local police precinct. The dark circles of exhaustion and anxiety had vanished from beneath her eyes. She wore a bright, vibrant yellow dress that cut through the dismal gray atmosphere of the criminal courtroom like a brilliant ray of sunlight. She sat with perfect, unbroken posture, her small hand safely enveloped within the massive, calloused grip of her grandfather. When Vanessa's frantic, scanning eyes finally locked onto the teenager she had actively tried to destroy, Aaliyah did not flinch. She did not look away, nor did she display a single ounce of fear. Furthermore, Aaliyah's expression held absolutely no vindictive anger or burning hatred. She looked at her former stepmother with profound, unadulterated pity. Aaliyah viewed the shackled, degraded woman in the orange jumpsuit not as a terrifying monster, but as a broken, pathetic shell of a human being who had traded her entire soul for a bank account she could not even keep. That steady, pitying gaze pierced Vanessa's armor far deeper than any screamed insult or judicial reprimand ever could. It unequivocally signaled that Vanessa held zero power over the Crawford family. The psychological grip was permanently broken. Aaliyah simply offered a slight knowing nod of absolute finality, silently dismissing the predator back into the shadows where she belonged. The harsh, authoritative voice of the judge snapped Vanessa's attention back to the high wooden bench. The judge did not mince words, delivering a scathing rebuke of Vanessa's predatory manipulation, her blatant disregard for human life, and her systemic abuse of the family court system. With a cold, uncompromising tone, the judge declared that such malicious actions warranted the maximum allowable penalty under federal guidelines. The judge raised the heavy wooden gavel high into the air and brought it crashing down against the sound block with a booming, thunderous crack. She officially sentenced Vanessa to 10 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely revoking any possibility of early parole or conditional release. The immediate finality of the sentence broke the last remaining thread of Vanessa's composure. The two heavily armored guards stepped forward instantly, gripping her upper arms with bruising force. As they forcefully dragged her away from the defense table, Vanessa snapped. She thrashed against the restraints, her voice tearing through her throat in a ragged, hysterical shriek. She screamed Evan's name into the sterile void of the courtroom, begging for a rescue from a man who was no longer there. The guards hauled her backward through the restricted side doors, ignoring her violent, thrashing protests. The heavy steel door swung shut behind them, slamming into its reinforced frame with a deafening metallic crash that severed her frantic screaming completely. The courtroom plunged into a sudden, absolute silence. Aaron let out a slow, steady breath. He turned to Aaliyah, offering a warm, reassuring smile. He gently patted her shoulder, his rough hand grounding her in reality. He spoke with a quiet, undeniable certainty, telling his granddaughter that the nightmare was finally over. They stood up together and walked out of the courtroom. 1 year had passed since the heavy steel doors of the federal penitentiary slammed shut on Vanessa, and the punishing storm washed away Evan's manufactured empire. The oppressive, suffocating tension that once choked the life out of Aaron's modest suburban home had completely vanished. Golden morning sunlight streamed through the clean glass of the kitchen window, casting warm geometric patterns across the scarred wooden floorboards. The rich, comforting aroma of freshly ground black coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air entirely, replacing the sterile, high-stakes anxiety of corporate boardrooms and criminal courts. Aaron stood at the stove, turning the bacon with a pair of metal tongs, his posture relaxed and his shoulders finally free from the crushing weight of impending betrayal. He wore his familiar faded denim and canvas jacket, looking exactly like the retired blue-collar mechanic he always pretended to be. The profound, earned peace resonating through the house was not a stroke of luck. It was the direct, calculated result of Aaron completely excising the toxic rot that had threatened to consume his bloodline. The relentless corporate espionage, the frantic midnight extraction teams, and the vicious courtroom battles felt like a distant, fated nightmare. The house was quiet, but it was not the hollow, terrifying silence of isolation. It was the steady, secure tranquility of a fortress that had successfully weathered a catastrophic siege. Aaron plated the breakfast and set 2 ceramic mugs on the dining table. He looked out the window at his manicured lawn, breathing in the crisp morning air. The violent adjustment of his family's hierarchy had been brutal but absolutely necessary to ensure survival. Aaliyah walked into the kitchen, her bright energy entirely filling the room. She was no longer the defensive, terrified teenager bracing for the next psychological attack or bracing for a midnight extraction team. She pulled out a wooden chair and sat at the table, a confident smile illuminating her face as she carefully sealed a stack of thick premium envelopes. They contained her final polished applications to 3 Ivy League universities. Aaron handed her a plate of food, his chest swelling with quiet, unshakable pride as he watched the brilliant young woman she had become under his absolute protection. The rhythmic chime of the front doorbell interrupted their quiet morning routine. Aaron walked down the hallway and pulled open the heavy oak door. Evan stood on the front porch. He did not wear a custom-tailored charcoal suit or imported leather shoes. He wore a faded, sweat-stained uniform from a regional logistics warehouse, his hands rough-blistered and calloused from months of grueling manual labor. Evan did not posture with his former executive arrogance, nor did he fall to his knees begging for a corporate bailout. He stood tall, offering a respectful, measured nod to his father. Evan politely asked if he could borrow a few tools to repair the loose wooden planks on the front steps. He sought no financial favors, requested no access to banking accounts, and expected no immediate forgiveness. He was simply putting in the agonizing, repetitive work required to rebuild his shattered character from the absolute bottom. Aaliyah stepped into the hallway, holding her sealed college applications. She looked at her father in his soiled uniform. The fear and resentment were gone, replaced by a cautious, fragile curiosity. Aaron stepped aside, gesturing toward the tool shed in the backyard, allowing his son to slowly earn back the trust he had so carelessly thrown away. Later that afternoon, Aaron left the quiet sanctuary of the suburbs and traveled back into the beating heart of the financial district. He bypassed the crowded lobbies and rode the private elevator directly to the top floor of the city's most formidable legal firm. He stepped into Rachel Thorne's expansive executive office, the panoramic glass walls showcasing the gleaming metallic skyline of the empire he secretly controlled. Rachel sat behind her polished mahogany desk, projecting the same lethal, icy professionalism that had flawlessly dismantled Vanessa in family court. She did not offer small talk or pleasantries. She pushed a single thick leather folder across the smooth surface of the desk. The folder contained the finalized, legally binding mandates for the Crawford Corporate Blind Trust. Aaron sat in the high-backed leather chair, pulling a heavy fountain pen from his inner pocket. He reviewed the complex financial stipulations, the impenetrable legal walls, and the strict distribution clauses with the sharp analytical precision of a true titan of industry. Rachel watched in absolute silence as Aaron brought the pen down against the crisp, watermarked paper. His firm, decisive signature officially transferred the ultimate authority of his massive, multi-billion-dollar empire out of his direct control. He was executing the final phase of his master plan, ensuring that the Crawford fortune could never again be weaponized by a predatory outsider or squandered by a gullible executive. Aaron reviewed the final page, verifying that the airtight legal armor would absolutely withstand any future litigation, bankruptcy claims, or hostile corporate takeovers. The wealth was entirely locked away behind an impenetrable wall of world-class jurisprudence, safe from the greed that had nearly destroyed them. The meticulously structured documents did not list Evan Crawford as the primary beneficiary. The man who had sacrificed his own flesh and blood to protect a corporate illusion was entirely legally severed from the generational wealth. Instead, the massive fortune, the real estate holdings, the international tech investments, and the vast offshore capital were legally placed into a locked trust exclusively designated for Aaliyah. The mandate contained a ruthless, unbreakable stipulation that the funds would completely unlock on her 25th birthday, ensuring she possessed the maturity, elite education, and grounded life experience to manage the empire. Evan would inherit absolutely nothing, permanently forcing him to survive on the meager wages of his warehouse labor and the genuine strength of his own character. Rachel collected the signed documents, stamped them with her official seal, and locked them away in her reinforced steel safe. The future of the Crawford bloodline was now written in stone. Aaron closed the empty leather folder and leaned back in his high-backed chair. He picked up the ceramic mug of black coffee waiting on the edge of the desk and took a slow, deliberate sip. He looked out over the sprawling, sunlit city skyline, feeling the profound weight of his lifelong responsibilities finally lifting from his shoulders. He had successfully orchestrated the total destruction of a ruthless parasite, forced his arrogant son into facing genuine accountability, and secured an untouchable, gilded future for the only innocent victim of the entire ordeal. Aaron Crawford set his coffee mug down on the mahogany desk, having protected his family, secured his massive legacy, and perfectly executed the ultimate silent adjustment. True wealth is never defined by corporate acquisitions, sprawling estates, or limitless offshore bank accounts. It is entirely forged through the unshakable foundation of family loyalty, unbreakable moral integrity, and the courage to demand absolute accountability. When greed blinds a person to the safety of their own bloodline, financial ruin becomes the only effective teacher. A quiet, methodical correction is vastly more powerful than a loud, chaotic vengeance. We must protect the innocent, severely punish the malicious, and allow the deeply flawed to rebuild their shattered character through agonizing, repetitive hard work. Redemption must be earned, never handed out freely. If you found this story of a silent, calculated adjustment compelling, please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more dramatic narratives.